On the outside, Emily and Daniel Thompson seemed like the perfect couple. Living in a picturesque suburban neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina, they had the life many only dreamed of. Their marriage was the type people envied, or so it appeared. Daniel was a successful real estate agent, and Emily, a stay-at-home mom to their 2 children, was beloved by everyone for her charm and kindness. They were active in their community, attending charity events, hosting barbecues, and spending holidays with close friends. One of those friends was Jessica Miller, Emily's closest confidante. Jessica had been in Emily's life for years. The two met during a college orientation and bonded instantly, their friendship surviving the ups and downs of adult life. Jessica was a striking blonde, vivacious and outgoing, the kind of person who could light up a room with her laughter. Emily had always admired her confidence. What she didn't know was that behind that charismatic facade, Jessica was hiding a dark secret, one that would shatter Emily's life forever. The cracks in Emily and Daniel's relationship began to show as Daniel became distant, spending late nights at the office and avoiding family dinners. Emily was initially dismissive of these changes, chalking them up to work stress. But when Daniel's absences became more frequent, her suspicions grew. She thought maybe there was another woman. What she didn't expect was that it would be someone she knew, let alone trusted. One evening, Emily sat down at the kitchen table after putting the kids to bed. She opened her laptop to browse through emails and stumbled upon something unusual. An email from Daniel's account sent to a James T. The message wasn't explicit, but it was clear something was going on between them. Emily's heart sank as she realized who the initials belonged to. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the weight of betrayal crashing over her like a tidal wave. Jessica Miller, her best friend, was the other woman. She felt sick to her stomach, trying to process the enormity of it all. How long had this been going on? What lies had been told to keep it hidden? And why hadn't she noticed the signs earlier? For days, Emily wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to confront them both immediately, but another part of her didn't want to believe it was true. She spent hours replaying every conversation, every interaction, searching for clues she might have missed. Every shared laugh between Jessica and Daniel now seemed suspicious. Every glance exchanged felt tainted with deception. Determined to uncover the full truth, Emily began investigating, searching through Daniel's phone when he was asleep, checking his calendar for suspicious gaps. The more she dug, the more apparent it became that the affair had been going on for months, maybe even longer. There were late-night texts, secret meetups, and excuses made when Emily had been none the wiser. The betrayal gnawed at her, turning her once loving heart into a cauldron of rage. Emily began to change. Friends and family noticed her mood swings, but no one knew the extent of her inner turmoil. She couldn't talk to anyone not without exposing her husband's infidelity or ruining her friendship with Jessica in a way she wasn't yet prepared for. But Emily's rage continued to simmer, growing with each passing day. She stopped sleeping, her mind plagued by thoughts of revenge. Jessica had stolen something sacred, and Daniel had betrayed their vows, defiling their marriage. Emily's heartbreak transformed into something darker, something more dangerous. The time for confrontation was drawing closer, and when it came, it would not be pretty. The betrayal wouldn't just be avenged, it would be punished. Emily knew she couldn't keep pretending. The rage that had built up inside her needed to be released. She wanted them both to feel the weight of what they had done. She devised a plan, methodical and cold, a reflection of the betrayal she had suffered. Confronting Daniel alone wasn't enough. No, they both needed to be present, trapped in their lies together. It was the only way she could feel any sense of justice. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Emily put her plan into action. She invited Jessica over for dinner, just like old times. Daniel would be home as well, under the pretense of spending some quality time together. Jessica, as expected, accepted without hesitation. Why wouldn't she? Emily thought bitterly. She probably felt secure in her betrayal, smug even. As the evening approached, Emily meticulously prepared the house, setting the table for 3, lighting candles as if she were preparing for a peaceful family dinner. But her mind was far from at ease. A knife, sharp and gleaming, lay within reach on the kitchen counter, though her guests would never know it. When Jessica arrived, her usual bright smile beamed across her face, and Daniel greeted her with a casual familiarity that made Emily's skin crawl. For a brief moment, Emily wondered how long they had managed to deceive her so convincingly. The dinner began with light conversation, and Emily played her part well, hiding the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. But as the evening wore on, Emily could no longer stomach the charade. She set down her fork, her voice barely above a whisper. How long, she asked, her eyes trained on Daniel. Daniel blinked, confused. What do you mean? How long have you been screwing my best friend? Emily's voice cut through the room like a razor, cold and sharp. Jessica's face paled instantly, her smile faltering as the realization of what was happening dawned on her. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to fear, his eyes darting between the two women. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about," Jessica stammered, trying to recover her composure. Emily's eyes were wild with fury as she slammed her hand on the table, causing both of them to jump. "Don't you dare lie to me. I've seen the messages. I know everything." Daniel looked at Jessica, then back at Emily, panic evident in his face. Let's just calm down. We can talk about this." "Talk," Emily interrupted, her voice laced with venom. "The time for talking is over." The air in the room grew thick with tension as Daniel and Jessica sat frozen, unsure of what Emily would do next. Emily stood up slowly, her eyes locking onto Daniel's. "You destroyed everything," she said, her voice eerily calm now. "You both did." Daniel stood up, trying to approach her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Emily, please. It was a mistake. We can work through this. We can." "Work through this?" Emily laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the room. "You think I can just forget this? That I'll just move on while you two pretend like nothing happened?" Jessica, finally finding her voice, chimed in. "Emily, I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far." Emily's eyes snapped toward Jessica, and for the first time Jessica saw something in her friend that terrified her. It was a darkness she had never seen before. "It just happened," Emily repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "You didn't mean for it to go this far." Emily's hand twitched, her thoughts spiraling into a dangerous place. The knife was just within reach, and her fingers itched to grab it, to end this nightmare once and for all. But she hesitated. Something in her wanted them to suffer, to feel the pain she had endured. The minutes stretched, thick with tension, as Emily stood there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the fear in their eyes now, the same fear she had felt when she first discovered their betrayal. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Without warning, Emily lunged toward the kitchen counter, her hand closing around the cold steel of the knife. Jessica screamed, backing away from the table, but there was nowhere to go. Daniel stepped forward, trying to shield her, but Emily's rage was beyond control now. "You think you can destroy my life and walk away?" Emily hissed, her eyes wild. "You think there are no consequences for what you've done?" The knife glinted under the dim light of the dining room, a symbol of the twisted betrayal and the raw, unbridled hatred that had consumed Emily. Time seemed to slow down as Emily stood in the center of the room, gripping the knife with white-knuckled intensity. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief, and Jessica stood paralyzed in the corner, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The once cozy atmosphere of the dining room had turned into a battlefield, drenched in fear and betrayal. "Emily, please," Daniel began, his voice trembling. He took a step forward, but Emily's sudden movement stopped him dead in his tracks. She raised the knife, her hand steady, despite the overwhelming emotion swirling inside her. "You cheated on me with her," Emily spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You lied to me. You made me feel like a fool in my own home." Jessica's voice, shaky and desperate, cut through the silence. "Emily, we didn't want to hurt you. We—" "Shut up," Emily roared, her fury exploding as she spun toward Jessica. "You were my best friend. You were supposed to be there for me, not sleeping with my husband behind my back." Jessica stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall, eyes wide with terror. "It was a mistake." "A mistake? You call destroying my life a mistake?" Emily's voice was raw, filled with pain and anger that had been festering for months. She moved closer to Jessica, the knife glinting in the candlelight. "You both betrayed me, and now you're going to pay." Daniel lunged toward Emily, but he wasn't quick enough. With a swift, precise motion, Emily plunged the knife into his abdomen. His eyes widened, the color draining from his face as he staggered backward, clutching his stomach. Blood began to pool on the floor as Daniel gasped, collapsing to his knees. "Emily, please," he croaked, his voice weak, filled with disbelief. Emily didn't answer. Her mind was clouded by rage, unable to hear his pleas. She turned her attention to Jessica, who had fallen to the floor, her back pressed against the wall. The reality of the situation had finally settled in, and Jessica's face was frozen in horror. "Please," Emily, Jessica begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Emily didn't stop. She advanced toward her, the knife still dripping with Daniel's blood. Jessica scrambled to her feet, trying to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Emily grabbed her by the arm, forcing her back against the wall. "You deserve this," Emily whispered, her voice icy. "You both do." And with that, Emily drove the knife into Jessica's chest, the blade sinking deep into her flesh. Jessica gasped, her eyes wide with shock as the life drained out of her. Emily pulled the knife back, her hands trembling as she watched her former friend crumple to the ground, lifeless. The room was silent now, save for the faint gurgling sounds coming from Daniel as he lay bleeding out on the floor. Emily stood there, panting, her hands covered in blood, her mind numb. The rage that had consumed her for so long was now replaced with an eerie sense of calm. She looked down at what she had done. The bodies of the two people who had shattered her world lying motionless at her feet. Emily's mind raced as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The adrenaline that had driven her through the violent act was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She looked down at her hands, slick with the blood of her husband and her former best friend. What had she done? The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt alien. The blood-stained floor, the overturned chairs, and the grotesque stillness of the bodies made everything seem like a twisted nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. It was real. She backed away slowly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to think, to make sense of the chaos. What would happen next? She couldn't stay here, not with the bodies. But what could she do? Her mind raced through the possibilities, but every option seemed impossible. She couldn't run. The neighbors might have heard something. She couldn't clean it up. There was too much blood, and she certainly couldn't call the police. As Emily stood frozen in the living room, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at it, her stomach knotting as she realized who it might be. Was it someone calling to check on Daniel? Or worse, had someone already figured out what had happened? She walked over to the phone, her hand trembling as she picked it up. It was a text from her sister, asking about plans for the upcoming weekend. Emily stared at the message for a long moment, her mind completely detached from the normalcy of it all. How could the world continue as if nothing had happened? How could everything still be the same when her life had just changed forever? Suddenly, Emily was hit by the overwhelming weight of her actions. The blood was on her hands, literally and figuratively. There would be no going back from this. The person she had been, the loving wife, the trusted friend, the devoted mother, was gone. All that remained was a woman who had taken everything into her own hands and destroyed it all in a single night of fury. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for a solution, a way out, but there was none. The consequences of her actions were coming, and there was no escape from the aftermath. Emily stood motionless in the kitchen, her mind racing as the gravity of what she'd done sank in deeper. The adrenaline that had driven her to murder was gone, leaving her trembling, her legs weak beneath her. She glanced at Daniel's motionless body, the pool of blood spreading across the floor, and then at Jessica, slumped against the wall, her eyes forever frozen in terror. Panic began to set in. She couldn't stay here. If she did, it would only be a matter of time before someone came looking for Daniel or Jessica. She had to get out, had to think clearly. But where could she go? Her two children were upstairs, sleeping peacefully, unaware that their father lay dead just below their bedrooms. The thought of them jolted her back to reality. Emily rushed up the stairs, careful not to wake them as she peeked into their rooms. Her heart ached at the sight of their small, peaceful faces, oblivious to the destruction that had unfolded. She couldn't bear the thought of them finding the bodies in the morning, nor could she stomach the idea of leaving them alone. But staying wasn't an option. Tears welled in her eyes as she packed a small bag for them, throwing in clothes and essentials for herself as well. She wiped her face, trying to think through the tears. She would drive. She didn't know where, but she needed to leave before anyone came looking for Jessica or Daniel. There would be questions, investigations, and she couldn't let the kids be dragged into this. As she packed, the sound of a car engine passing by made her freeze. Her heartbeat quickened, and she rushed to the window, peering through the curtains. The street outside was empty, and the house sat in darkness, as if nothing had happened. Emily took a deep breath and wiped her blood-stained hands on a towel, cringing at the sight of the crimson smears. She had to get out of here. Quickly. She grabbed her phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing the one person she thought might be able to help her brother, Sean. He lived a few hours away, and though they hadn't been particularly close over the past few years, she had no one else. Sean had always been practical, a problem solver. She needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who could help her figure out what to do next. The phone rang twice before he answered, groggy. "Emily, it's late. What's going on?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, barely able to contain her panic. "Sean, I need your help. I've done something bad." There was a long pause on the other end. "What happened?" What happened?" Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "I'll explain everything later, but I need you to meet me. I need to leave Charleston, tonight." Sean's voice was serious now. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "No, I'm not okay," Emily whispered, glancing once more at the blood-streaked floor below. "Please, just meet me. I'll text you the address." Sean agreed, though she could hear the confusion in his voice. She knew he'd have questions. What she didn't know was how she'd answer them, but for now she had to keep moving. She went back downstairs, avoiding the sight of Daniel's and Jessica's bodies. She grabbed the keys to the family SUV, making sure everything was packed. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she moved around the house. What she was leaving behind no longer felt like her home, just the scene of a double murder. Emily pulled the car out of the garage and parked it in the driveway, taking one last glance at the house. Her stomach twisted as the weight of her actions threatened to overwhelm her. But there was no time to dwell on it. She needed to disappear, and quickly. The drive through Charleston's quiet streets felt surreal. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her pulse pounding in her ears. The children were asleep in the backseat, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had consumed their lives. The city's streetlights flashed by in a blur, and every turn she made felt like it would be her last moment of freedom. Her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. The bodies would be discovered soon, maybe by morning, maybe earlier if someone tried to contact Jessica or Daniel. And once that happened, the police would come for her. They'd look for her at home, at the children's schools, at her friends' houses, and eventually they'd find her brother, Sean. She hadn't told Sean the full story over the phone. How could she? The truth was too horrifying to admit even to herself. She had killed 2 people. One of them was her husband, the father of her children. No matter how justified she felt in her actions at the moment of rage, she knew deep down that she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. After driving for an hour, she pulled into a gas station just off the highway. She parked in the far corner, away from the lights, and took a deep breath. The weight of what she had done was crushing her chest, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't go back, she knew that. But where could she go? She checked her phone. Sean had texted back, agreeing to meet her at a diner halfway between Charleston and his town. It was in a rural area, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might recognize her. That was her best shot for now. Emily stepped out of the car and stared at her reflection in the gas station's glass door. Her face looked gaunt, her eyes hollow. She barely recognized herself. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. How had it come to this? As she stood there, the gas station attendant glanced at her briefly before turning back to his work, uninterested. Emily felt a wave of paranoia sweep over her. Did he know? Could he tell just by looking at her that she was a murderer? She turned away quickly and headed back to the car, not wanting to risk staying in one place for too long. As she continued down the highway, the darkness of the night matched the dark cloud of guilt and fear that hovered over her. Every sound, the hum of the engine, the occasional passing car, even the children's soft breathing from the backseat felt amplified, suffocating her. The reality was sinking in. There was no escaping the consequences of what she'd done. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the distant lights of the diner came into view. The small, run-down building sat at the edge of a desolate highway, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. It was well past midnight, and the place was nearly deserted, save for a lone pickup truck parked near the entrance. She parked the car in the back, away from the light, and glanced at her phone. Sean had texted her again, "I'm here." "Where are you?" Emily didn't reply, too consumed by the overwhelming fear of what was to come. The children remained fast asleep in the back seat, unaware of the storm swirling around them. Taking a deep breath, Emily got out of the car and walked toward the entrance. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have answers to. What would Sean think? Could he help her, or would he turn her in? She felt like a stranger in her own body, her guilt so heavy that it threatened to suffocate her. The bell over the door chimed as she stepped inside. Sean was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as she entered, his face tight with concern. His eyes immediately found hers, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the brother she had known all her life, the one who had always been there for her, no matter what. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't just his sister, she was a fugitive. "Em," he said quietly, standing up as she approached. "What the hell is going on?" Emily collapsed into the booth across from him, burying her face in her hands. She felt the weight of everything crashing down on her, the guilt, the fear, the shame. She wanted to explain, but the words felt too heavy, too impossible to form. I killed them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sean's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "What do you mean, you killed them?" Emily looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel and Jessica. I killed them, Sean. I found out about the affair, and she choked on the words, her chest heaving as the sobs racked her body. "I lost control. I didn't mean to, but Sean sat back in his seat, his face pale, trying to process what his sister had just confessed. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly grappling with the enormity of the situation. "Jesus, Emily," he muttered under his breath. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," Emily cried. "I was just so angry. I couldn't stop myself. And now they're dead. I don't know what to do." Sean stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He had always been the calm, rational one in the family, but this was something he had never prepared for. His sister had killed 2 people. His mind flashed to his niece and nephew, asleep in the car. They had no idea their lives had just been ripped apart. "Okay," Sean said finally, his voice steady but low. "We don't have a lot of time. You can't go back home. The police are going to find them soon, and they'll be looking for you. The first thing they'll do is come after you." Emily wiped her eyes, her breathing still ragged. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. Sean shook his head, his mind working fast. "I don't know yet. But we need to get you and the kids somewhere safe, somewhere far away from Charleston." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You need to disappear." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. Disappear. She had never imagined her life would come to this, running from the law, hiding from the consequences of her actions. But what other option did she have? The alternative was a prison cell, or worse, her children growing up without their mother. Sean stood up, his decision made. "We're heading to the cabin." The cabin. A small, secluded place their family had inherited from their grandparents, buried deep in the woods of North Carolina. Hardly anyone knew about it, and it hadn't been used in years. It was isolated, quiet, a perfect place to hide. "Pack up the kids," Sean instructed. "I'll follow you there. We'll figure out the rest when we're safe." Emily nodded, her body moving on autopilot as she left the diner and returned to the car. She glanced at the back seat where her children still slept peacefully, oblivious to the horrors their mother had committed. Her heart ached as she started the car and followed Sean out of the parking lot. As they drove into the darkness of the night, Emily's mind drifted to the future. She had no idea what awaited her, or if she would ever be able to live with what she had done. All she knew was that there was no turning back now. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of her guilt would follow her wherever she went. But for now, she was running from her crime, from her past, from the life she had destroyed. The cabin loomed ahead, hidden in the dense woods like a secret long buried. It was the middle of nowhere, the kind of place no one would think to look. The gravel crunched under the tires as Emily pulled up next to Sean's truck. The children stirred in the back seat but didn't wake. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to believe that they could be safe here, that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the nightmare she had created. Sean stepped out of his truck, his face grim as he walked toward her. The weight of the situation hung heavily between them. Without a word, he helped her carry the kids inside, placing them on the old, dusty couches in the living room. Emily watched them for a moment, her chest tightening. She couldn't bear the thought of what their lives would become if she was caught. Sean disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 beers. He handed one to Emily and sat down across from her, his eyes dark with worry. "We'll stay here for a few days," Sean said quietly, "just until we figure out what to do next." Emily nodded, her mind numb. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, and she couldn't see a way out. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't go back, not now, not ever. But deep down, Emily knew the truth. No matter how far she ran, no matter how long she hid, the guilt would never leave her. It was a part of her now, etched into her soul. The blood on her hands would never wash away. As she sat there in the cabin, the silence of the night pressing in around her, Emily realized that there was no escaping the reckoning that would come. The law might not find her right away, but her conscience already had. And in the end, that might be the punishment she feared the most. The next few days at the cabin passed in a tense, suffocating silence. Emily's mind remained haunted by the images of Daniel and Jessica, their lifeless bodies still fresh in her thoughts. She barely slept, her guilt growing heavier with each hour. Sean tried to remain calm, but Emily could see the cracks forming in him too. He was just as scared as she was, though he wouldn't admit it. The isolation of the cabin, once comforting, now felt like a prison. Every sound in the woods, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a branch, made Emily's heart race, as if she were waiting for the inevitable arrival of police lights cutting through the trees. But the night stayed dark and quiet, and no one came. Yet, on the 4th morning, as the sun filtered weakly through the cabin windows, Emily sat at the worn wooden table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. She knew it couldn't last like this. Hiding in the cabin with her children, pretending that she could run forever, wasn't a life, and it wasn't fair to them. Sean entered the room, looking weary. "Emily, we need to talk." She nodded, knowing what was coming. She had felt it too, the sense that they couldn't keep running. "There's only so much time before they find out you're missing," Sean said, sitting down across from her. "Daniel and Jessica's bodies. They've probably already been discovered. It's only a matter of time before the police are on your trail." Emily lowered her eyes. "I know." Sean sighed deeply, his hands clasped together on the table. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to stop running. You need to turn yourself in." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words stung, but deep down, she had known this moment was coming. She had felt the weight of her actions crushing her more and more each day. There was no escape. Sean was right. But the kids, she whispered. Her voice cracked with emotion as she thought of her 2 children, who were still asleep in the next room. They'll lose everything. Sean reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. They still have me. I'll take care of them, Emily. But if you keep running, it's only going to get worse. They'll never understand why their mother disappeared. Tears filled Emily's eyes. She had already stolen so much from her children, their father, their stability, their entire world. Was she really going to steal herself away from them too? She wiped her face, her heart breaking. I don't want to leave them. I don't want them to hate me. They won't hate you, Sean said softly. They're too young to understand now. But when they're older, they'll know that you did the right thing by facing this. You have to give them that. Emily sat in silence, the gravity of Sean's words sinking in. She had reached the end of the road. There was no more running, no more hiding. She would never be able to live with herself if she dragged her children into this life of fear and escape. The guilt she carried would haunt her forever, but at least by turning herself in, she could give them some kind of future. She stood up, her decision made. Her body felt heavy as she walked to the back room where her children slept. She knelt beside their beds, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. A sob escaped her lips as she kissed them both gently on the forehead, knowing it might be the last time she held them as a free woman. Sean met her at the door, his eyes filled with sorrow. I'll drive you, he said quietly. We'll go to the nearest police station. Emily nodded. The cabin that had once been her refuge now felt like a distant memory, like a place that belonged to another version of her, someone who didn't exist anymore. The drive to the police station was eerily quiet. Emily watched the trees pass by, each mile bringing her closer to the end of her old life. She thought of Daniel, the betrayal, the violence that had erupted in their home. She thought of Jessica, and how her closest friend had shattered everything she held dear. And now, there was only the reckoning. When they finally arrived, Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they pulled into the parking lot. Sean turned to her, his face pained. Are you sure you want to do this? Emily swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes again. I have to, she whispered. For the kids. Together they walked into the station. The sterile smell of the building, the buzz of police officers moving about, felt surreal to Emily, as though she were watching it all happen from outside her own body. She stepped up to the front desk, her voice shaking as she spoke the words that would change her life forever. I'd like to turn myself in, she said, barely able to get the words out. I killed my husband and my best friend. The officer behind the desk froze, staring at her for a moment before signaling for another officer to come forward. The process began quickly. She was handcuffed, her rights read to her, and led away from Sean. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but there was a strange sense of relief that washed over her. The running was over. As she was escorted through the station, Emily glanced back at her brother. Sean stood by the entrance, watching as she was taken away, his face full of sadness but also of understanding. He had promised to care for the children, and Emily knew he would keep that promise. As the cell door closed behind her, Emily sat on the cold bench, her mind racing. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. She knew she would face judgment, both from the world and from herself, for the rest of her life. But for the first time since that terrible night, she felt a sliver of peace. She had made the only decision she could, and no matter what happened next, she had done it for her children. The reckoning had come, but Emily was ready to face it. Jamal Williams, a 27-year-old software programmer from Brooklyn, had spent months preparing for his wedding to Rachel Carter. Rachel, a successful social media personality with a wide following, had captivated Jamal with her charisma and ambition. Her followers adored her for her honesty and openness about her life, though she had always kept her personal details, her past, her family, her struggles at a guarded distance. This element of mystery intrigued her fans and had only deepened Jamal's interest in her when they first met through mutual friends. For Jamal, this wedding was a moment of pure celebration and new beginnings. Behind the joyful preparations, however, there was an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. Diana Williams, Jamal's 52-year-old mother, had made no secret of her disapproval of the union. Diana was a fiercely protective and commanding woman who had raised Jamal on her own after his father left when he was a child. In her eyes, no one was truly worthy of her only son, and her protective nature veered into obsession when it came to Rachel. Despite Rachel's best efforts to win her over, Diana's stance remained unyielding. Diana viewed Rachel as an outsider, a possible manipulator, and, most alarmingly to her, a potential threat to her influence over Jamal. As the wedding date drew near, Diana's opposition only intensified. She began delving into Rachel's past, using every resource at her disposal to unearth anything that might solidify her claims. As a woman who had grown up in a small, traditional community, Diana harbored strong views on how women should present themselves. She could not comprehend Rachel's online persona and perceived her openness as shameless self-promotion. Late into the night, Diana would pore over Rachel's old posts, scrutinizing each word, each photograph, each trace of her life before Jamal. And then she found something, a small, shadowed piece of Rachel's past that confirmed her worst suspicions. The details Diana discovered, though ultimately mundane, were enough to fuel her hatred and deepen her conviction that Rachel was dangerous. From that moment on, her determination to stop the wedding became her singular obsession, a dark mission she believed was solely for her son's benefit. Friends and family noticed her growing fixation but assumed it was simply maternal worry. No one foresaw the lengths Diana would ultimately go to, and no one suspected how that day at the altar would take a tragic turn. The air was filled with anticipation on the morning of Jamal and Rachel's wedding. The venue, a picturesque chapel in upstate New York surrounded by towering oaks and blooming wildflowers, was designed to capture Rachel's dream of an intimate, enchanting ceremony. Every detail, from the flowers lining the aisle to the flickering candlelight, was carefully chosen by the bride to create a magical atmosphere. Guests began arriving, friends and family eager to celebrate the love between Jamal and Rachel. The guests' whispers, laughter, and excitement filled the chapel as they settled into their seats. Jamal stood at the altar, dressed in a crisp black suit, his face a blend of nerves and excitement. He awaited Rachel's entrance, taking slow, deep breaths to steady himself. His closest friends flanked him, offering encouraging nods. Despite his nerves, his eyes gleamed with pure happiness, reflecting the joy that the day symbolized for him. But amidst the smiles and celebrations, Diana's presence was a foreboding shadow. Diana sat in the front row, her expression fixed in a stony mask. Dressed in a severe dark gown, she seemed out of place among the other guests, many of whom had opted for soft celebratory colors. Her gaze was unrelenting, fixed upon Jamal with a determined, almost fanatical intensity. She watched each moment unfold as though she were a predator, ready to pounce at the first sign of threat to her son. Rachel finally made her entrance, radiant in her white dress, her smile bright and wide as she locked eyes with Jamal. For a moment, all the tension, all of Diana's cold stare, and all the worries that had plagued Jamal and Rachel over the past months seemed to melt away. Their eyes met, and Jamal felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The chapel quieted as Rachel walked down the aisle, the only sound being the soft rustle of her gown and the occasional murmur of admiration from the guests. As the officiant began the ceremony, Diana's hands clenched around the small clutch bag she held. Inside, her fingers brushed against the cold metal handle of a cake knife she had brought from the reception area, tool that had no place here but had been brought with purpose. In her mind, she had convinced herself that this was her duty, her last resort to protect Jamal from what she believed to be a grave mistake. The vows began, and Jamal spoke with sincerity and warmth, describing how Rachel had changed his life, how she had taught him to be brave, to open up, to live fully. His voice shook slightly as he expressed his love, looking at Rachel with a devotion that stirred the guests' emotions. As he finished, the congregation let out a collective sigh, touched by his words. Rachel, tearing up, prepared to share her own vows, glancing lovingly at her soon-to-be husband. But just as she began, a loud voice pierced the air, Diana's voice, rising in fury, cutting through the moment like a knife. The room fell silent as Diana Williams' voice rang out, laced with anger and disdain. Guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging shocked glances, unsure how to respond. The officiant froze, caught off guard by the sudden interruption. All eyes were on Diana, who had risen from her seat, her face twisted with fury. Without hesitation, she began to hurl accusations at Rachel, her words sharp and vicious. She painted Rachel as an imposter, a deceiver who, in her view, was manipulating Jamal for personal gain. To many in attendance, Diana's accusations seemed bizarre, but the ferocity behind her words was unsettling. Jamal's face turned pale as he stood, immobilized, unable to believe what was unfolding. Rachel, visibly shaken but resolute, stood her ground. Her hands gripped her bouquet tightly, knuckles white, her gaze unwavering. She was familiar with Diana's disapproval but hadn't anticipated this level of public humiliation on her wedding day. A murmur rippled through the guests, torn between sympathy for Rachel and discomfort at the spectacle Diana was creating. Jamal finally found his voice, urging his mother to stop, his tone laced with desperation. He attempted to calm Diana down, to de-escalate the situation and salvage what remained of their ceremony. But Diana's resolve was impenetrable. She was consumed by her belief that she was acting in Jamal's best interest, that this was her final stand to protect him. Then, in one swift, horrifying motion, Diana reached into her clutch. Before anyone fully grasped what was happening, she lunged forward, clutching the cake knife. Her target was clear. With unyielding determination, she plunged the blade into Rachel, cutting short the wedding, the vows, and a life in a single, brutal act. Rachel gasped, her bouquet slipping from her hand, the vibrant flowers scattering across the chapel floor. The crowd erupted in screams and chaos as guests tried to process the horrific scene before them. Jamal's scream was drowned out by the rising panic, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and heartbreak as he reached for Rachel, his hands trembling. In a matter of seconds, the joyful atmosphere of the ceremony had transformed into a nightmare. Jamal held Rachel close, his hands stained with blood as he tried futilely to stop the bleeding. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and agony, unable to speak but communicating everything she felt in those last moments. Diana stood back, watching her son cradle Rachel's lifeless body, her expression unreadable. In her mind, she had accomplished what she set out to do. She had protected her son from what she saw as a dangerous mistake. As guests shouted for help, the horror of what she'd done began to settle over the room. Diana's demeanor changed, her composure slipping as she took in the full weight of the scene she had created. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by panicked guests who had fled the chapel to call for emergency assistance. Officers entered the building, their faces grim as they took in the scene, the shattered groom, the bloodied bride, and the distraught guests who remained in stunned silence. Diana Williams, the mother of the groom and the perpetrator, stood by in shock, her eyes vacant, as if she too was coming to terms with the irreversible consequences of her actions. The arrest was swift and unceremonious. Diana offered no resistance as officers cuffed her, her gaze fixed on Jamal as he held Rachel's lifeless body. Paramedics arrived, but there was nothing to be done. Rachel was gone, her life extinguished in the very place where she had come to celebrate her love and future. Diana was led out of the chapel, her silence echoing through the space. The guests, many of whom had known Diana for years, found themselves grappling with disbelief and horror at the violence she had unleashed. In the days that followed, the story made headlines, capturing national attention as a case of unimaginable betrayal. "Mother murders bride at altar," blared the headlines, along with phrases like "wedding day horror" and "family tragedy unfolds in front of dozens." Journalists swarmed the town, attempting to piece together the factors that led to this violent climax. Diana's friends, co-workers, and neighbors were interviewed, and the narrative that emerged painted a disturbing portrait of a woman who had lost her way, consumed by a possessive and obsessive love for her son. For Jamal, life became a haze of grief and guilt. His nights were plagued by recurring nightmares of the attack, his mind replaying the scene over and over, searching for a way he could have prevented the tragedy. Therapy became his only solace, but even that felt insufficient to address the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The mother who had raised him, who had been his guardian and protector for so many years, had transformed into the very person who shattered his life in the most unimaginable way. In prison, Diana offered no apology for her actions. During her trial, she justified her behavior by claiming she was protecting Jamal from what she believed was a dangerous woman. Her defense painted her as a mother overwhelmed by misguided concern, but the jury saw it differently. After a brief deliberation, Diana Williams was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The trial of Diana Williams captivated the nation, drawing media attention from across the country. Journalists from major networks descended on Brooklyn, documenting every stage of the case. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public, each eager to witness the proceedings. Many residents of Pine Lake and Brooklyn alike were eager to understand what had driven a mother to commit such an unfathomable crime on her own son's wedding day. The prosecution painted Diana as a manipulative and deeply possessive woman, whose obsession with her son led her to cross moral boundaries. They presented evidence of her controlling behavior, her intrusive investigations into Rachel's past, and her escalating anger as the wedding date approached. Witnesses, including Jamal's close friends and family members, testified about her increasing hostility and bizarre actions in the months leading up to the wedding. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came in the form of a journal discovered during the investigation. Diana had kept meticulous notes detailing her suspicions and frustrations over Rachel. In the journal, she referred to Rachel as a threat and spoke of eliminating her as the only solution. To the prosecution, the journal was a damning piece of evidence demonstrating premeditation in Diana's state of mind. They argued that Diana's actions were driven not by genuine concern for her son, but by a twisted need to control his life, even if it meant destroying him in the process. Meanwhile, the defense attempted to frame Diana's actions as those of a mother overwhelmed by fear for her son. They brought in psychologists to testify about Diana's mental state, describing her as a woman suffering from delusions and paranoid tendencies. They claimed that she genuinely believed Rachel posed a threat to her son, painting Diana as a tragic figure who acted out of misguided love. Jamal attended every day of the trial, sitting silently in the back of the courtroom, visibly distraught. He refused to make eye contact with his mother, whose cold expression remained unbroken. To the world, he became a symbol of unimaginable grief, a man betrayed by the very person he had once trusted most in the world. Friends and strangers alike reached out to him, but he struggled to find solace, unable to make sense of the tragedy. As the trial progressed, public opinion began to shift. Many who had initially sympathized with Diana saw the brutality of her actions for what it was. The town, too, struggled with the reality of the crime. In Pine Lake, where Diana had been a respected figure, neighbors expressed shock and horror. The place that had once seemed safe and insular now held the dark shadow of tragedy, and the residents grappled with the realization that someone they thought they knew had harbored such malice. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. In a tense, packed courtroom, Diana Williams was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, condemning her to live the rest of her days within prison walls. As the sentence was read aloud, Diana's composure cracked for the first time. A single tear traced down her cheek, though whether it was from regret or a final realization of her lost freedom, no one could say. Jamal felt an intense wave of relief, yet it was tinged with sorrow. He had spent months hoping for closure, yet watching his mother being led away in handcuffs did little to soothe the ache that had settled within him. The trial had forced him to relive the trauma again and again, and each moment seemed to deepen the wound. He couldn't reconcile the mother who had raised him with the woman who had destroyed his life in a fit of delusional rage. In the days following the verdict, Jamal tried to piece together a new life. Support poured in from friends, his therapy sessions intensified, and he even returned to work, attempting to rediscover a sense of normalcy. Yet the shadow of what had happened followed him everywhere. The wedding that was meant to symbolize the beginning of a new life had ended in horror, and each day was a reminder of Rachel's absence. Friends offered invitations urging him to move on, but the betrayal from his mother left scars that ran deep. No matter how much he tried to accept the tragedy, the questions lingered. The media eventually moved on, the headlines fading as new stories emerged. The town of Pine Lake gradually returned to its quiet routines, though memories of the horrific event lingered like a scar in the minds of its residents. Diana's home, once filled with family memories, became an empty shell, abandoned and silent. For Jamal, it was a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. The journal Diana had kept was eventually given to Jamal, its pages detailing her obsession in stark detail. He read it only once, each entry revealing a mother whose love had transformed into an irrational, possessive need. Closing the journal, he realized there was no true explanation, only a warped, painful reflection of a woman who had allowed herself to be consumed by her own darkness. In the end, Jamal made a decision to leave Brooklyn. The memories of Rachel, the ghosts of his former life, haunted the streets he had once loved. He moved to a quiet town upstate, seeking peace and solitude, hoping to finally rebuild the life that had been stolen from him on that fateful day. Jamal's relocation offered him a much-needed distance from the painful memories of his former life. He chose a small town upstate, an unassuming place where he could blend in, hoping to escape the prying eyes and lingering whispers of Brooklyn. The town's quiet streets and secluded nature promised him solitude, a chance to start anew without the shadow of tragedy lurking around every corner. Jamal rented a modest one-bedroom apartment overlooking a lake, its waters calm and reflective, like the peace he hoped to find. He started a new job with a tech firm that allowed him to work remotely, providing him the stability of work without the daily pressure of socializing. His days took on a new rhythm, one focused on healing. Early mornings were spent jogging along the lakeside, afternoons working, and evenings in quiet reflection, piecing together fragments of who he was outside of the trauma. Therapy remained an anchor in his life, and though he was hesitant at first, he agreed to participate in grief counseling sessions specifically tailored for individuals affected by violent crime. In these sessions, he found himself connecting with others who had been through equally devastating losses. The group became a source of comfort, a place where he could speak openly without judgment or discomfort. With time, he began to share his story in bits and pieces, each admission feeling like the release of a burden he had carried for far too long. In one particular session, Jamal spoke about Rachel, about the way her laughter could light up a room, her relentless optimism, and the plans they had made. He spoke about the betrayal he felt, the betrayal that had come not only from his mother's violent act but from her inability to see Rachel as the loving, kind person he knew. As he spoke, the group listened intently, offering words of empathy and validation. Slowly, he began to feel less isolated, less burdened by the tragedy he had kept locked away. Months passed, and Jamal found himself wanting to confront his grief and anger more directly. He couldn't ignore the ache of unanswered questions. His mother's actions had left him with a gnawing need for understanding, though he knew that some aspects would remain a mystery forever. One morning, he decided to visit the prison where Diana was being held, a decision that took weeks of mental preparation and consultation with his therapist. His goal was not forgiveness but closure to confront the woman who had robbed him of Rachel, his future, and a mother he thought he knew. The prison was cold and foreboding, its walls towering and gray against the winter sky. Sitting in the sterile visiting room, Jamal felt a weight settle over him, a mix of anger and sadness pressing down on him. When Diana was brought in, she looked older, her face lined with an exhaustion that prison life had only deepened. She met his gaze with a mixture of shame and defiance, as though she were both sorry for what she had done and resolute in her belief that she had acted out of love. Their conversation was strained, punctuated by moments of painful silence. Jamal asked her why she felt so threatened by Rachel, why she had let her hatred consume her to the point of violence. Diana's answers were fragmented, a web of paranoid justifications and distorted claims of protecting her son. It became clear to Jamal that she still held onto her belief that she had saved him from a mistake. Her reasoning was convoluted, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she lacked true remorse. She had rewritten the narrative in her mind, framing herself as a misguided but well-meaning mother, rather than a murderer. Leaving the prison that day, Jamal felt a strange sense of finality. He understood that his mother's obsessive love had blinded her, leading her down a path of irreversible destruction. While the visit didn't bring him the understanding he'd hoped for, it confirmed one thing: he needed to let go of any expectation of remorse or resolution from her. This realization marked a turning point. Jamal returned to his new life with a sense of acceptance, acknowledging that some wounds would never fully heal, but that he could still rebuild, even with the scars left behind. As months turned into years, Jamal continued piecing together a new life, holding on to the memories of Rachel that still brought him solace. He began to volunteer with a local organization that supported families affected by violent crime, finding purpose in offering comfort to others who, like him, had suffered unspeakable losses. The work was difficult, often reopening his own wounds, but it was also healing. Every story he heard reminded him of the strength it took to rebuild after tragedy. In Rachel's memory, he established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in media and communication. Through the fund, he hoped to honor Rachel's ambition and passion for connecting with others. Rachel had always been a champion for voices that weren't often heard, and Jamal felt that supporting young women who might follow in her footsteps was a way of ensuring that her legacy lived on. Word of the scholarship spread through social media, and soon Rachel's fans and followers, many of whom had mourned her loss, contributed to the fund. The scholarship became a small but enduring tribute, a bright spot amid the darkness left behind by her death. Jamal's life became anchored in quiet routines. He took up hiking, spending weekends exploring trails along the lake near his new town, finding peace in the silence of the forest. Each step along the winding paths was a reminder of his own journey, of the pain he carried but also the strength he had found to keep moving forward. He began keeping a journal, filling it with memories of Rachel, reflections on his grief, and insights from the therapy sessions that had become a permanent fixture in his life. Through his volunteer work in the scholarship fund, he found himself slowly emerging from the isolation that had once held him captive. He reconnected with old friends and eventually opened himself up to the idea of new relationships. He was careful, taking each step cautiously, aware of how deeply the scars of his past had marked him. It took time to trust, to believe that he could let people in without fear of further loss. But he also recognized that Rachel's life and the love they had shared had taught him the importance of openness and connection. Jamal's mother, Diana, remained in prison, and though he would occasionally receive letters from her, he rarely opened them. Each letter, he imagined, was another attempt to justify what could never be justified. He kept them in a small, unmarked box, unread but acknowledged, like pieces of a past he had long left behind. They were reminders of a painful chapter, one he had chosen to close for his own peace. In time, Jamal felt a shift within himself. The rage, the despair, and the loneliness that had once dominated his life began to fade. In their place was a quiet resilience, an understanding that while tragedy had shaped him, it did not define him. The memory of Rachel remained his guiding light, a reminder of love and joy that could never be erased by the violence of a single day. Years later, Jamal stood at the edge of the lake near his home, watching the morning sun cast a warm glow over the water. He reflected on how far he had come from that dark day at the chapel. Though the pain had lessened, it had not disappeared. Instead, it had transformed into something he carried within him, a quiet strength rather than an open wound. In the time since the tragedy, Jamal had found new friendships and even love. He shared his story openly, both as a testament to Rachel's life and as a way of reclaiming his own. Though he never forgot the devastation of that day, he also chose to remember the years of happiness, laughter, and love he had shared with Rachel. Those memories had become a part of him, woven into his very being, and they brought him comfort even in moments of sorrow. The scholarship fund in Rachel's name continued to grow, helping dozens of young women pursue their dreams. Each recipient represented another piece of Rachel's legacy, another life touched by the kindness and ambition that had defined her. In this way, Jamal felt that Rachel's influence lived on, her spirit a guiding force that continued to bring light into the world. Diana remained incarcerated, and Jamal accepted that she would never truly understand the magnitude of what she had done. But he also came to terms with the fact that her actions were beyond his control and that he could choose his own path forward. Rather than letting the shadow of her crime dictate his life, he focused on building a future that honored Rachel's memory and allowed him to find peace. As he stood by the lake, Jamal took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of release. His journey had been long and painful, marked by betrayal and loss, but also by resilience and growth. He had chosen to rise above the tragedy, to find purpose in the aftermath, and to carry forward the love that had once filled his life. In the end, Jamal understood that while he would always carry the scars of that day, he had also discovered an inner strength, a resilience that allowed him to transform pain into purpose and to create a life that honored Rachel's memory. And as the sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the lake, he knew he had finally found peace. Years after the tragedy that had redefined his life, Jamal found himself at the annual ceremony for the Rachel Carter Memorial Scholarship. The scholarship, now in its 10th year, had grown substantially, helping over 100 young women pursue careers in media, journalism, and communications. As he watched this year's recipients step forward to accept their awards, Jamal felt a quiet pride and a deep sense of fulfillment. The scholarship had become more than a tribute. It was a legacy, a way of ensuring that Rachel's warmth, strength, and passion would live on through others. The people who gathered to honor Rachel's memory each year had become a second family for Jamal. Friends, colleagues, and scholarship recipients filled the room, each of them carrying forward a part of Rachel's story. They shared stories of how she had inspired them, laughing and reminiscing about her vibrant personality, her kindness, and her remarkable influence. Though she was gone, her spirit lingered in the lives she had touched, a gentle but enduring presence that time could not erase. Daniel Lawson was the type of man who believed his life was destined for stability. He had worked hard as an accountant in the bustling city of Seattle, establishing a routine that felt as predictable as the tides. At 35, he was neither exceptionally ambitious nor prone to indulgence. He was practical, grounded, and content with what many would consider an ordinary life. But there was something missing: companionship. After years of casual dating and fleeting relationships, Daniel longed for something more meaningful. That's when Sarah entered his life. Sarah Harris was a woman who seemed to embody everything Daniel was looking for. Beautiful, confident, and charismatic, she carried herself with an air of mystery that only heightened her allure. They met through an online dating app, their initial conversations peppered with jokes and the usual small talk that transitioned into deeper discussions about life, dreams, and aspirations. Within months, their whirlwind romance took root, with Sarah quickly becoming the center of Daniel's universe. She moved into his downtown apartment, and soon after, Daniel found himself head over heels in love. Their relationship had a seamless quality, as though the universe had conspired to bring them together. While friends commented on the speed at which things had escalated, Daniel brushed off any concerns. After all, when you know, he would tell them. Just 9 months after their first meeting, Daniel proposed in the middle of a candlelit dinner. Sarah accepted, tears glistening in her eyes as she slipped the ring onto her finger. Their wedding was planned for 6 months later, an intimate ceremony at a picturesque vineyard outside Seattle. To the outside world, their relationship appeared flawless. Sarah's poised demeanor made her seem the ideal partner for Daniel, while he basked in the glow of his new life. Daniel's family embraced Sarah, although there was an unspoken reservation in the way his mother and sister interacted with her. They never voiced their concerns, and Daniel never questioned their quiet unease. In the grand scheme of things, everything seemed perfect. The wedding day arrived without a hitch. The couple exchanged vows under the golden sunlight, their love seemingly palpable to everyone present. Friends and family watched with teary eyes as Daniel and Sarah promised each other forever, unaware that this perfect union harbored dark secrets. That night, they retreated to a luxurious suite in a nearby hotel, the world expecting them to embark on the happiest journey of their lives. But the truth that awaited Daniel was far from the blissful honeymoon he had imagined. The wedding night would reveal a truth that would shatter Daniel's world and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he had married. As they entered the hotel suite, a bottle of champagne awaited them on ice, a gift from the hotel staff to congratulate the newlyweds. Daniel poured them both a glass, toasting to their future as Sarah smiled nervously. The excitement of the day seemed to catch up with them, and Daniel could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. He had always been a traditional man, saving certain intimacies for marriage, convinced that it was part of what made his relationship with Sarah so special. But as the night wore on, that anticipation began to shift. It was in Sarah's eyes a flicker of hesitation, something Daniel hadn't seen before. She suggested they sit down and talk, but Daniel, wrapped in the warmth of their new beginning, dismissed her concerns. They were married now, and any discussion could wait until the morning. What mattered was the start of their life together. It was only as they prepared for bed that Sarah's demeanor truly changed. She became withdrawn, her movements slow and deliberate. Something was off. Daniel, now keenly aware of the tension between them, questioned her. His voice broke the silence, soft but firm, asking her what was wrong. And that's when the truth came out. Her real name was Edward Harris. She had undergone gender reassignment surgery years ago, living as Sarah ever since. For the entire duration of their relationship, Sarah had carefully avoided revealing her past, believing that the love they shared would be enough to carry them through the revelation. But now, in the silence of the hotel room, the truth came rushing out in gasped sentences, as though it had been strangled by years of fear. Daniel stood motionless. He couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. In his mind, the woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, suddenly ceased to exist. Rage, confusion, and disbelief surged through him in a flood of emotions. He demanded answers, his voice rising as Sarah Edward tried to explain. But in Daniel's mind, there was no explanation that could make sense of what had just been revealed. His fury took hold. In a blur of anger and betrayal, Daniel acted on impulse. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, from the nightstand and struck Edward across the head. The force of the blow was sudden and brutal. Edward collapsed instantly, blood pouring from the wound as Daniel stood above him, shaking, his mind racing with disbelief at what he had done. The hotel suite fell into silence. The only sound was Daniel's labored breathing as he stared at the lifeless body of the person he had thought was his wife. In one catastrophic moment, Daniel's life had spiraled into chaos. Panic gripped him, and his mind immediately went into survival mode. He couldn't let anyone know what had happened. No one could find out the truth. Daniel's thoughts raced as he began to consider how to cover up the crime. His first instinct was to dispose of the body. If no one found Edward's remains, perhaps no one would ever know. He quickly began to clean up the scene, wiping down surfaces, gathering towels to soak up the blood, and dragging the body to the bathroom. He would need to figure out a way to get Edward out of the hotel without raising suspicion. But as Daniel's mind raced, he was unaware that the events of this night had already set in motion an investigation that would unravel everything he had worked to conceal. Detective Samuel Morris, a seasoned investigator with the Seattle Police Department, would soon be at the center of this unfolding mystery. Daniel Lawson worked frantically to erase any evidence of the violent act he had just committed. His hands trembled as he dragged Edward's lifeless body into the hotel bathroom, his mind spinning with panic and disbelief. Every fiber of his being was focused on survival, on avoiding the unthinkable consequences of what had just occurred. He refused to let his life, his career, his reputation be destroyed in a single, terrible night. In the bathroom, he filled the bathtub with water, his body moving automatically, as if on autopilot. He had no plan, only a desperate desire to hide the truth. He submerged the body, hoping somehow the water would make the cleanup easier, but the sight of Edward's bloodied face under the water only made the situation more gruesome. So Daniel's hand shook as he splashed water over the tiled floor, spreading the mess further in his frenzy. Hours passed. Daniel's attempts to clean were erratic and ineffective, driven by sheer panic rather than any coherent strategy. Towels soaked in blood littered the floor, the smell of iron and death permeating the air. Daniel gagged as he tried to wipe the blood from his hands and arms, but the stains clung to his skin. The wedding suite, once pristine and luxurious, was now a scene of horror, a macabre reflection of the night's events. Realizing he couldn't remove the body without drawing attention, Daniel shifted focus. His mind, racing for solutions, landed on the idea of making it look like Sarah, or rather Edward, had disappeared. And if he could stage a disappearance, perhaps he could delay the discovery of the truth long enough to figure out his next move. He stripped the body of its wedding dress, stuffing the bloodied garment into a hotel laundry bag. He knew the dress was a key piece of evidence, but he couldn't think clearly enough to dispose of it yet. Edward's phone was next. He opened it, deleting messages, clearing their call history, anything that might connect the two of them. He threw the phone into the bathtub as well, hoping the water would erase any remaining digital traces. As the sun began to rise, Daniel dressed in the same clothes he had worn the day before. He took one last look at the suite. It was still a mess, far from the clean slate he had hoped for, but it would have to do. His mind could no longer process the details, consumed instead by a singular thought: escape. With a hastily packed bag, Daniel left the suite, his heart pounding as he made his way down the hotel corridor. He passed guests and hotel staff on his way to the parking garage, each glance from a stranger feeling like a direct accusation. He kept his head down, moving quickly toward his car, praying that no one had noticed anything unusual about his departure. By the time he reached the highway, Daniel had convinced himself that he could make this work. He would go home, act normal, and if anyone asked, Sarah had decided to leave him. Maybe she had cold feet. Maybe they had an argument. In time, people would stop asking questions. Or so he hoped. But deep down, Daniel knew he was only delaying the inevitable. This wasn't something that would simply go away. For now, all Daniel could do was hope. But what he didn't know was that Edward's disappearance was already raising suspicion, and the hotel staff had already reported an unusual amount of blood found in the wedding suite. His carefully laid plans were starting to unravel before he even had the chance to see them through. Detective Samuel Morris was used to receiving early morning phone calls, but the one he received that day was different. A seasoned detective with the Seattle Police Department, Morris had seen his share of domestic disputes, violent crimes, and missing persons cases, but something about this call immediately struck him as odd. The report came from a hotel on the outskirts of the city, where an unusual scene had been discovered in a suite booked for a wedding night. A maid, arriving early to clean the room after the newlyweds had checked out, found blood-stained towels, a torn wedding dress, and the remnants of what appeared to be a violent struggle. The guest, a woman named Sarah Lawson was nowhere to be found. Morris arrived at the scene within the hour, his instincts already telling him that this wasn't just a case of a runaway bride. The hotel room bore the unmistakable signs of a cover-up, poorly concealed bloodstains on the floor, a bathroom that smelled heavily of bleach, and the absence of any belongings typically left behind after a sudden departure. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something far more sinister than a bride with cold feet. As Morris and his team began their initial examination, they discovered something even more alarming. Submerged in the bathtub, they found a wedding ring and a phone, both heavily damaged by water. Whoever had tried to clean the scene hadn't been thorough, which only deepened Morris's suspicion that this was more than just a hasty exit. Interviews with the hotel staff revealed that Sarah and her husband, Daniel Lawson, had been seen together the previous night, celebrating their wedding with champagne in the hotel bar. There had been no indication of trouble. The maid who discovered the room reported a single disturbing detail: the bed hadn't been slept in. Morris knew that time was of the essence. He issued a missing persons report for Sarah Lawson and began digging into her background. It wasn't long before inconsistencies in Sarah's life story began to emerge. There were no records of a Sarah Harris in Seattle before her relationship with Daniel. Even more curiously, her past seemed entirely fabricated, almost as if she had appeared out of nowhere. That's when Morris received a tip that would shift the investigation entirely. A former acquaintance of Sarah's reached out to the police after seeing the news about her disappearance. He revealed that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be. She was Edward Harris, a man who had transitioned years prior and had been living under a new identity ever since. This revelation turned the case on its head. Now, instead of a missing bride, Morris was looking at a much darker scenario. Had Daniel discovered the truth about his wife's identity on their wedding night? And if so, what had he done in response? The detective's mind raced as he pieced together the possibilities. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was likely the cover-up of a murder. Morris knew that tracking down Daniel was now his top priority. If Sarah, or rather Edward, was dead, then Daniel Lawson was a man on the run. Morris's years of experience told him that Daniel wouldn't get far. Men like him, driven by rage and fear, often made mistakes in the heat of the moment. All Morris needed to do was find the cracks in Daniel's story. The investigation had only just begun, but already the detective could feel the weight of the truth lurking beneath the surface. Detective Samuel Morris stood at the center of the now cordoned-off hotel suite, staring at the mess that Daniel Lawson had left behind. The shredded wedding dress, the bloodstains, and the submerged phone told a story of panic, rage, and a desperate attempt to hide something terrible. But Morris had seen enough crime scenes in his career to know when a cover-up was poorly executed. He could almost feel the guilt, the fear, that had gripped Daniel in those frantic moments after the murder. By midday, Morris had enough evidence to treat the case as a homicide rather than a missing persons report. The absence of Sarah's body, combined with the bloodstains and other suspicious details, led him to one clear conclusion: Daniel Lawson had murdered Edward Harris, the person Daniel had known as Sarah. The next step was tracking Daniel down before he had a chance to disappear for good. Morris issued an arrest warrant for Daniel, now a suspect in the murder of his spouse. The first order of business was to alert airports, train stations, and border control agencies in case Daniel tried to flee the state or the country. A man like Daniel would want to run, to escape the weight of his actions. But Morris also knew that Daniel didn't have the kind of criminal background that would help him avoid capture for long. Daniel wasn't a hardened criminal, he was an accountant who had lost control. And that worked in the detective's favor. So back at the police station, Morris assigned a team to gather more information about Daniel's background. They needed to know his habits, his favorite places, and his connections. Detectives combed through his financial records, searching for recent purchases that might hint at his whereabouts. They reached out to his friends and family, asking if anyone had heard from Daniel since the wedding. But so far, no one had. It seemed Daniel had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the wreckage of his life. Then came the break Morris had been waiting for. Daniel's car, a dark blue Honda Civic, had been spotted on a traffic camera heading south on the I-5 highway, just outside of Seattle. The timestamp put him on the road early that morning, only a few hours after the murder. Morris had a hunch that Daniel wasn't just trying to leave the city, he was heading somewhere specific. After digging deeper into Daniel's personal life, Morris discovered that Daniel had family in Oregon, a cousin who owned a remote cabin in the woods near Eugene. The cabin was rarely used, a perfect hideout for someone who wanted to disappear. For Morris suspected that Daniel was heading there, hoping to lay low until the storm blew over or until he could figure out his next move. Morris immediately alerted local authorities in Oregon, requesting their assistance in apprehending Daniel. He ordered a team of officers to set up surveillance around the cabin, ensuring that they could move in as soon as Daniel arrived. The detective knew that this was their best shot at capturing Daniel before he slipped away into the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the cabin's location. Meanwhile, Morris couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was still missing. The absence of a body weighed heavily on him. Despite the blood found in the hotel suite, there was no physical proof of Edward's death. Without a body, the case would be harder to prosecute. He needed more than just circumstantial evidence if they were going to charge Daniel with murder. As Morris drove toward Oregon to oversee the operation, he found himself reviewing the case in his mind, turning over every detail. There was still a piece of the puzzle missing, a part of the story that hadn't yet revealed itself. He had to hope that once Daniel was in custody, the truth about what happened on that wedding night would finally come to light. Daniel Lawson drove southward, his mind a chaotic swirl of panic and desperation. The gravity of his actions weighed down on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into despair with every passing mile. He knew he couldn't turn back now. The moment he had struck Edward, everything had changed. There was no undoing what had happened in that hotel room. His life, once so structured and predictable, had become a nightmare in the span of a few violent minutes. Daniel's destination was clear in his mind, his cousin's cabin in the Oregon woods. He hadn't spoken to his cousin in over a year, but the cabin was isolated, a place where he could disappear for a while and figure out what to do next. As he sped down the highway, Daniel tried to convince himself that he could still salvage some semblance of a future, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the police caught up with him. Every car he passed, every set of headlights in his rearview mirror, felt like a threat. He expected flashing lights and sirens at any moment. The pressure was unbearable. He had barely slept in the past 24 hours, his mind replaying the events of the wedding night on an endless loop. Edward's face haunted him, the expression of fear and surprise when Daniel had lashed out. It wasn't Sarah. It was never Sarah. All of it had been a lie, and Daniel couldn't cope with the weight of that betrayal. By the time Daniel reached the outskirts of Eugene, exhaustion had taken hold. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding roads that led to the cabin. The quiet, wooded landscape felt surreal, almost like a dream compared to the chaos he had just left behind in Seattle. But even here, in the stillness of the forest, there was no escape from what he had done. He pulled up to the cabin just as dusk was settling in, the sky darkening overhead. The air was cool and quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to breathe, to believe that he might be safe here. He stepped out of the car, scanning the area. The cabin looked exactly as he remembered it, small, rustic, tucked away from the main road. No one would find him here, or so he thought. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished with a single bed, a small kitchen, and a wood-burning stove. Daniel dropped his bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, the weight of his exhaustion finally catching up with him. His mind was too clouded to form a plan. All he knew was that he needed time to think, to figure out what came next. But sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts were consumed with fear, regret, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. What Daniel didn't know was that the authorities were already closing in on him. The cabin, once his safe haven, was now surrounded by a team of police officers waiting for the right moment to make their move. Detective Morris, watching from a distance, knew that the next few hours would be critical. Daniel was a desperate man, and desperate men often did unpredictable things. As darkness settled in around the cabin, the trap was set. It was only a matter of time before Daniel's last attempt at escape came to a crashing halt. The night air was still, the thick canopy of trees around the cabin absorbing all sound. Detective Samuel Morris watched from a concealed position, his eyes locked on the dimly lit windows of the cabin where Daniel Lawson now hid. The team had surrounded the area, every exit covered, but the priority was to take Daniel alive. Morris had seen this kind of situation play out too many times, a fugitive on the edge, desperate and unpredictable. Any misstep could push Daniel to do something irrational, perhaps even violent. Morris gave the signal for the team to move in, their approach silent and methodical. They had waited until Daniel was deep into the night, exhausted, likely too tired to react quickly. As the officers positioned themselves outside, Morris felt the weight of the moment. Daniel wasn't a career criminal or someone used to life on the run. He was an ordinary man whose life had spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye. That made him dangerous, but it also made him fragile. The first sound Daniel heard was the soft thud of footsteps on the cabin's porch. Groggy and disoriented, he jolted awake. His heart hammered in his chest as he instinctively reached for the door, but before he could make it, the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on the wood echoed through the room. "Daniel Lawson, this is the Seattle Police Department. Come out with your hands up." The voice was firm, unyielding, cutting through the stillness. Panic surged through Daniel's body. His first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around him as the reality of the situation became clear. He was trapped. For a moment, Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. Could he negotiate? Could he somehow explain what had happened and convince them it was all a terrible accident? He imagined the headlines, the courtrooms, the prison sentences that awaited him. His future, everything he had built, was gone. His entire life had collapsed in a single, irreversible moment. The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. "Daniel, we know you're in there. But don't make this harder than it has to be." Sweat poured down his face as he realized there was no way out. His thoughts scrambled between surrendering and doing something drastic, but in his heart, Daniel knew he was too tired to fight anymore. His limbs felt heavy, weighed down by the events of the last 48 hours. Slowly, he moved toward the door, his movements sluggish, resigned. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the door. He blinked against the glare of the flashlight beams aimed at his face. Several officers stood in front of him, weapons drawn but pointed downward. There was no escaping this. He raised his hands, his voice barely above a whisper as he muttered, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Detective Morris, standing just behind the officers, stepped forward. He studied Daniel carefully, noting the exhaustion etched into his face, the weariness in his posture. There was no bravado, no resistance, just a broken man caught in the aftermath of his own choices. "Daniel Lawson, you're under arrest for the murder of Edward Harris," Morris said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words washed over Daniel like an ocean wave, but he barely registered them. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt his body go numb. It was over. The finality of it settled into his bones as the officers led him away, leaving behind the isolated cabin that had been his last hope of escape. Morris watched as Daniel was placed into the back of a police car, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps in the investigation. There would be an interrogation, a trial, and eventually the truth about what had really happened in that hotel suite would come out. But for now, Morris felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The hunt was over, and the suspect was in custody. The trial of Daniel Lawson captured the attention of the entire city. What began as a high-profile murder case soon revealed layers of complexity that neither the media nor the public had anticipated. For weeks, reporters dissected every detail of the case, the scandalous nature of Edward Harris's hidden identity and Daniel's violent reaction making it a subject of nationwide fascination. As the courtroom filled each day, Detective Samuel Morris sat quietly in the back, observing the proceedings. He had been instrumental in bringing Daniel to justice, but there was still much to uncover about that fateful night. The prosecution laid out their case meticulously, detailing how Daniel had killed Edward in a fit of rage after discovering the truth about his spouse's gender identity. The evidence was damning: the bloodstains in the hotel suite, the recovered dress, and Daniel's confession, though brief, all pointed toward a crime of passion. When Daniel took the stand, his appearance was markedly different from the man Morris had arrested weeks before. The once confident and composed accountant now looked hollow, defeated. In a strained voice, Daniel recounted the events of that night, speaking of the shock and betrayal he had felt upon learning that the woman he had married was not who she claimed to be. His account of the violent act was clouded by his own confusion and anger, but he never denied what he had done. The defense tried to argue that Daniel had acted in a state of temporary insanity, that his reaction had been driven by extreme emotional distress. They painted a picture of a man blindsided by deception, whose life had been torn apart by a secret he couldn't comprehend. But the jury was unmoved. The cold, brutal nature of the crime overshadowed any attempt at sympathy for Daniel's plight. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution made their final argument. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding Edward's identity, Daniel Lawson had chosen violence. He had struck out in anger, killing the person he had once professed to love. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict: second-degree murder. The sentence, 25 years to life in prison. In the days following the trial, Detective Morris reflected on the case. It was one of the most unusual he had ever worked, a tangled web of love, deception, and tragedy. Morris knew that at its core, this wasn't just a story about a murder. It was about how fragile human connections can be, how secrets can destroy lives in an instant. Edward Harris had sought love and acceptance under a new identity, but the truth had led to his tragic demise. Daniel Lawson, once an ordinary man with a promising future, would now spend decades behind bars, haunted by his actions. As Morris filed away the last of the case paperwork, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness for everyone involved. There were no winners here, only shattered lives left in the wake of a single, violent night. The city moved on, as it always did, but the echoes of the case lingered. Morris, for all his years on the force, knew he would never forget it. It was a stark reminder that the most dangerous secrets are the ones we hide from ourselves. Victoria Hale was known throughout Seattle's elite circles as the picture of success. A striking woman in her early 40s, she had it all: beauty, wealth, and a string of successful business ventures. Her life looked like the perfect story of a woman who climbed the ladder of success. But it was her love life that drew the most attention. Victoria had been married 4 times, and each of her husbands had met an untimely death. Her first husband, Michael Hale, was a well-known lawyer. He had died in a car crash on a rainy Seattle night, a tragedy that shook the local community. Victoria had been devastated, appearing heartbroken at the funeral as she clutched a black lace handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. No one suspected anything unusual. Michael's death seemed a tragic accident. But as the years passed and Victoria married again, whispers began to emerge. Her second husband, Gregory Walters, a tech entrepreneur, died from a sudden heart attack just 3 years into their marriage. Victoria played the role of the grieving widow once again, and while people talked about her terrible luck, no one said anything publicly. It wasn't until her third husband, Stephen Collins, a prominent surgeon, drowned in a boating accident that murmurs turned to suspicion. Then, when her fourth husband, Mark Dawson, died mysteriously in his sleep, the Seattle social scene could no longer ignore the string of deaths that surrounded Victoria. 4 husbands all dead, and the only common thread was Victoria herself. Despite the suspicions, there was never any hard evidence to suggest foul play. The police investigations had closed each case, ruling them accidental or from natural causes. But the name Seattle Black Widow began circulating in hushed tones, casting a dark shadow over Victoria's otherwise perfect image. Detective John Harris had been with the Seattle Police Department for over 20 years, and he had seen his fair share of strange cases. But something about Victoria Hale had caught his attention. Even though her name had never appeared on any official suspect list, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than just bad luck. Harris had worked on the initial investigation into Mark Dawson's death, the 4th husband to die under Victoria's roof. The cause of death had been officially ruled as a heart attack, but there had been some inconsistencies that nagged at him. Dawson had been a healthy man in his early 50s, no history of heart disease, and his medical records were clean, yet the autopsy had found nothing conclusive. Months after the case was closed, Harris still found himself drawn back to it. He requested the case files from each of Victoria's husband's deaths, reviewing them in detail. On the surface, everything looked routine. Each death had been signed off by the coroner as an accident or natural causes. But Harris knew that sometimes the devil was in the details. He began to notice a pattern. Each death occurred when Victoria was present, and there were often inconsistencies in the timelines of the events leading up to their deaths. Harris decided to dig deeper. He contacted the families of Victoria's late husbands, hoping to find any overlooked details that might shed new light on the deaths. While some of the families had accepted the tragedies and moved on, Others were still grappling with unanswered questions. The mother of Gregory Walters, Victoria's second husband, had never believed her son's death was natural. He was a strong man, never had a health issue in his life, she told Harris. Something wasn't right. I just know it. As Harris continued to pull on the threads of Victoria's past, he realized that the widow might not be so innocent after all. The question wasn't whether she was involved, but how she had managed to make each death look like a tragic accident. Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something bigger than just a series of accidents. As he delved into the backgrounds of Victoria's late husbands, he discovered something odd. Each one had a hefty life insurance policy, with Victoria listed as the sole beneficiary. While it wasn't unusual for spouses to name each other on their policies, the sheer size of these payouts made him uneasy. Michael Hale's death alone had netted Victoria nearly $2 million, and with each subsequent marriage, the policies had grown even larger. Harris reached out to the insurance companies to review the policies more closely. Each one had been taken out within 6 months of marriage, and the payouts had been made swiftly after the deaths. In every case, Victoria had been cooperative, providing necessary documentation and never raising suspicion. But it was the timing that troubled Harris. He knew that money was often a powerful motive, and with each husband's death, Victoria's fortune had ballooned. Still, nothing directly tied her to the deaths. Without solid evidence, the suspicions remained just that, suspicions. Harris needed something concrete, something that could reopen the cases and launch a formal investigation. He began to wonder if anyone from Victoria's inner circle might know more. If she had committed these crimes, surely someone would have noticed something. Harris decided to pay a visit to Claire Livingston, Victoria's personal assistant for the past 10 years. Claire had been by Victoria's side through all 4 marriages and had seen firsthand the aftermath of each tragedy. She was quiet, loyal, and fiercely protective of her boss, but Harris hoped he could get her to open up. When he arrived at Claire's modest apartment in downtown Seattle, she seemed hesitant but agreed to speak with him. Sitting at her kitchen table, Harris asked about Victoria's marriages, carefully probing for anything that might hint at foul play. "Mrs. Hale has been through a lot," Claire said softly, her hands nervously twisting a napkin. "Each loss was devastating for her. I don't know how she managed to stay so strong." But Harris wasn't convinced by her rehearsed response. "Claire, you've worked closely with her for a long time. You've seen things most people don't. I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to understand what happened." Claire hesitated, her eyes darting away. "She's a good person, detective. She loved them. Each one." But her voice trailed off, and Harris leaned forward, sensing a breakthrough. "But what?" he pressed. Claire swallowed hard. "It's just, sometimes things didn't add up. There were moments when I wondered if she cut herself off," looking panicked. Harris's heart raced. "If what, Claire? You can tell me." After a long silence, Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure Mrs. Hale is who she appears to be." Harris felt the weight of Claire's words hang in the air. The assistant was visibly shaken, and it was clear she was afraid of what. Harris wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: Claire was holding back something big. "Listen, Claire, I'm not here to judge anyone. I just need the truth," Harris said, trying to ease her nerves. "If something isn't right, you owe it to yourself to come forward." Claire glanced at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Then, after a deep breath, she finally spoke. "It's just the way they died, detective. It always seemed too perfect. Too clean. Every time she was with them, but nothing ever pointed back to her. And I overheard things, conversations on the phone, or when she thought I wasn't around." Harris's pulse quickened. "What kind of conversations?" Claire looked down at her trembling hands. "After Gregory's death, I overheard her talking to someone. She mentioned something about making sure there were no loose ends. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, after everything that's happened." "Who was she talking to? Did you ever find out?" Harris asked, leaning in closer. "I don't know. I never saw the number, and she was always careful. But there was something else," Claire continued, her voice shaking. "After Stephen died, she told me that it was a relief, that she felt free for the first time in years. That's when I started to get scared." Harris's mind raced as Claire's words sunk in. If Victoria had been talking about covering up loose ends and feeling relieved after her husband's deaths, it pointed to something far more sinister than accidents or bad luck. "What about Mark Dawson? Did you notice anything unusual around his death?" Harris asked, eager to piece together more of the puzzle. Claire bit her lip and nodded. "Yes, the night before he died, I was at the house late. Mrs. Hale had given me the evening off, but I forgot my phone charger and went back to the office in her home. I heard them arguing something about money. He was accusing her of lying to him, of hiding things. I didn't hear much more, but the next morning, he was dead." Harris sat back, his mind spinning. This was the break he needed: witnesses, phone calls, and arguments that painted a much darker picture of Victoria Hale than the grieving widow the public knew. But he still needed more. something undeniable to build a base. "Claire, if you're willing to help, we can take this further. We can protect you," Harris said, his tone firm but reassuring. Claire's eyes were filled with fear, but she nodded slowly. "I don't want to be part of this anymore, Detective. I'll tell you everything." With Claire's newfound cooperation, Detective Harris felt the tide turning. The information she had provided gave him a much clearer picture of what might have been happening behind closed doors. But he still needed hard evidence to build a case. He couldn't take down someone as powerful and well-connected as Victoria Hale with just suspicions and overheard conversations. He needed something solid. Claire agreed to hand over any records she had access to: emails, phone logs, anything that might show a trail of Victoria's suspicious activities. In the meantime, Harris decided to dig deeper into the financial side of things. He reached out to a forensic accountant within the department, asking him to comb through Victoria's finances over the last decade. If there was one thing Harris knew, it was that money leaves a trail, and people often make mistakes when they think no one is looking. A week later, Harris received the call he had been waiting for. The accountant had uncovered something troubling. "John, we found multiple offshore accounts linked to Victoria," the accountant said, his voice tense. "Millions of dollars have been funneled into these accounts shortly after each of her husband's deaths." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. This was it, the smoking gun he had been hoping for. Victoria had been careful to avoid suspicion, but even she couldn't hide the flow of money. The life insurance payouts, coupled with large sums of money being transferred to hidden accounts, painted a damning picture. As Harris pieced together the evidence, he realized that Victoria had been playing a long game. She had used her charm and intelligence to secure wealthy husbands, each time ensuring they had substantial life insurance policies. Then, after their sudden deaths, she quietly moved the money to offshore accounts, out of sight and out of reach. Harris contacted the insurance companies again, this time armed with the knowledge of Victoria's secret accounts. He worked with their legal teams to freeze her assets and halt any further payouts. With the financial evidence mounting, Harris knew it was time to confront Victoria herself. But he needed to proceed carefully. This was a woman who had, for years, orchestrated a series of deaths without ever raising enough suspicion to be investigated. Victoria Hale sat in her luxurious penthouse, gazing out over the Seattle skyline. She had always enjoyed the view from her top-floor apartment, the city sprawling beneath her feet like a kingdom she had quietly built. But today, something was different. She had noticed unusual activity with her bank accounts and sensed that someone was looking too closely at her affairs. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Claire's name flash on the screen. For a moment, she hesitated. Claire had been acting strangely recently, more distant, more nervous. Victoria had brushed it off as post-traumatic stress from Mark's death, but now she wasn't so sure. She answered the call, her voice cool. "What is it, Claire?" There was a long pause on the other end before Claire finally spoke, her voice shaking. I think you should know that the police have been asking questions about you, Victoria. About the husbands." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Why would they be asking about me? Everything has been settled. They're just trying to stir up old pain." I told them what I overheard," Claire stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." For a moment, Victoria felt a wave of fury, but she quickly suppressed it. "I see," she said icily. "Thank you for telling me, Claire. I'll take care of it." She hung up the phone and stared into the distance, her mind racing. Claire had betrayed her, and if the police were digging into her life, they might already be too close. Victoria had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone, but now she felt the noose tightening around her. That evening, as the sun set over the city, there was a knock on Victoria's door. When she opened it, she was met with the steely gaze of Detective John Harris, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Good evening, Miss Hale," Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "I think we need to have a conversation." Victoria flashed a polite smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Of course, Detective. Please, come in." Harris entered the pristine penthouse, taking in the sleek modern decor that screamed wealth and power. Victoria gestured toward the living room, where they both sat down. "I understand you've been asking questions about my late husband's," Victoria began, her voice smooth and controlled. "I assure you, Detective, these tragedies were just that, tragic accidents. I've suffered more than anyone can imagine." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've certainly had your share of tragedy, Miss Hale, but I'm not here to talk about your grief. I'm here because we've found some very troubling things. Offshore accounts, large transfers following your husband's deaths, conversations that suggest these weren't just accidents." Victoria's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, but she remained composed. "I'm a businesswoman, Detective. My finances are complex. Those accounts are perfectly legal." Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps. But the timing is convenient, wouldn't you say? And then there's Claire. She's told us a lot, Miss Hale. enough to warrant a full investigation. Victoria felt the weight of his words settle over her. She had always been able to outmaneuver anyone who got too close, but Harris was different. He wasn't just chasing a hunch, he had evidence. Victoria Hale had always prided herself on control over her business, her life, and the people around her. But as Detective Harris sat in her living room, calmly laying out the evidence he had gathered, that control began to slip through her fingers. The mention of Claire's betrayal stung, but she kept her expression calm, refusing to give Harris the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "Detective, I'm afraid Claire is mistaken," Victoria said coolly, folding her hands in her lap. "She's always been a bit fragile, especially after Mark's passing. I'm sure her mind is playing tricks on her." Harris didn't take the bait. "Fragile or not, she's provided us with enough to dig deeper. And I've been digging, Mrs. Hale. Those offshore accounts, they tell a very different story. Your finances, the insurance policies, your presence at the scene of each death, it's all adding up." Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her mind was racing. She had always anticipated the possibility of suspicion, but she had never expected anyone to come this close. Harris was more persistent than any of the other detectives she had dealt with. He wasn't going to be swayed by her charm or her money. "And let's not forget about your husband's deaths," Harris continued, his eyes locked on hers. "One death. Maybe it's a tragic accident. 2, unlucky. But 4 husbands, Mrs. Hale, all dying under mysterious circumstances. That's a pattern." Victoria felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she kept it buried. "You have no proof of anything, Detective," she said softly. "I loved my husbands. I did everything I could to save them, but sometimes fate is cruel." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Fate didn't kill those men, Victoria, you did. And you're not as untouchable as you think." For the first time, Victoria's mask faltered. Her eyes flickered with something cold and sharp, just for a moment, before she regained her composure. "This conversation is over, Detective. Unless you have a warrant, I'd like you to leave." Harris stood slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're right, Mrs. Hale. I don't have a warrant, not yet, but it's coming. I'm going to take you down one way or another." As Harris and his team left, Victoria stood at her window, watching them disappear into the night. Her mind whirred with the reality of the situation. She had underestimated the detective, and now the walls were closing in. She needed to plan a way out before everything collapsed. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Max," she said when the line connected, "it's time. I need your help." The man on the other end was silent for a moment before responding in a low, gravelly voice. "I told you, Victoria, I'm done with that life." "Well, you owe me," she replied, her voice hardening. "And you don't want me to remind you why?" There was another pause and then a resigned sigh. "What do you need?" Victoria's lips curled into a cold smile. "An exit strategy." The following morning, Detective Harris returned to the precinct, frustration gnawing at him. The confrontation with Victoria had yielded nothing but more stonewalling. She was too good, but Harris knew her confidence would be her downfall. She was unraveling, and he could sense it. Now, it was just a matter of time. As he sat at his desk, sifting through the mountain of paperwork related to the case, his phone buzzed. It was Claire. He answered immediately, his tone sharp with urgency. "Claire, what do you have for me?" Claire's voice trembled on the other end. "I'm scared, Detective. I don't know if I should have told you everything. Victoria knows I've talked to you. I think she's planning something." Harris's heart sank. "Listen to me, Claire. You're doing the right thing. I'll make sure you're protected. But you need to tell me everything now." There was a brief silence, then Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a safe in her house, behind a painting in her study. She's always been secretive about it. I've never seen inside, but I know she keeps files in there. Documents. Maybe. I think it's important." Harris's pulse quickened. This could be the break he needed. "Claire, this is huge. Can you get inside the safe?" "I don't know the combination," Claire said nervously, "but I've seen her open it a few times. I think I can figure it out." Harris paused, thinking quickly. "I don't want you to do anything risky, Claire, but if you can get those documents, it could change everything." After ending the call, Harris felt a surge of hope. The safe in Victoria's house could hold the key to her undoing evidence she had kept hidden from the world. If Claire could retrieve it, they might finally have enough to bring charges against Victoria. As the day went on, Harris prepared a warrant, focusing on the financial records and offshore accounts. He needed to move fast. Victoria Hale was smart, and if she suspected that the investigation was closing in on her, there was no telling what she would do. Just as Harris was finalizing the paperwork, his phone rang again. This time it was Claire, her voice panicked and frantic. "Detective, you need to come. I got into the safe. But it's worse than I thought. There are things in here, things you need to see. Hurry. Harris grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, knowing that this could be the moment that everything came crashing down for the Seattle Black Widow. Detective Harris drove through the dark, rain-soaked streets of Seattle, his mind racing. Claire's panicked voice echoed in his ears. Whatever she had found in Victoria's safe had shaken her to the core. He had a sinking feeling that what awaited him might be even worse than he imagined. When he arrived at Claire's apartment, she was already pacing nervously by the door, clutching a worn envelope in her hands. Her eyes were wide and she looked pale, like someone who had just glimpsed something terrible. "Claire, what is it?" Harris asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Without a word, Claire handed him the envelope, her hands trembling. "You need to see for yourself. It's not just financial documents, detective. It's something else." Harris opened the envelope and pulled out the contents. Inside were several papers, all neatly organized life insurance documents, bank statements confirming the offshore transfers, and something else. Photos. Dozens of them. Harris's stomach twisted as he flipped through the images. Each photo depicted one of Victoria's late husbands, captured at various points before their death, sitting in a hospital bed, lying unconscious on the floor, or sprawled in a bathtub. The photos were chillingly intimate, as if someone had been documenting their last moments. And in each one, there was Victoria, always in the background, her face a cold mask of indifference. These are from the nights they died," Harris muttered, unable to look away from the horrific evidence. "She took these photos." Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "There's more. In the back of the safe, there were notebooks, journal entries. She wrote about them, detective, about how she planned each death." Harris's hands shook as he reached for the notebooks, flipping through the neatly written entries. Victoria had chronicled everything in chilling detail: how she had slowly poisoned Michael, how she had tampered with the brake lines in Gregory's car, how she had manipulated Stephen's medication, and how she had suffocated Mark in his sleep. "Jesus Christ," Harris breathed, his heart pounding. It was all here: confessions, motives, detailed accounts of each murder. Victoria had been playing a twisted game all along, and she had documented it as if it were a sick trophy. She wrote that it was never about the money, Claire whispered, her voice shaking. It was about control. She got some kind of pleasure from it, watching them suffer. She called it freeing them. Harris felt a wave of nausea roll through him. He had suspected Victoria was capable of murder, but this was worse than he had imagined. She wasn't just a killer, she was a sadistic mastermind who took pride in her work. "We need to get this to the DA," Harris said, his voice grim. "This is enough to charge her with multiple counts of murder." Claire looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What if she knows? What if she comes after me, detective? She's dangerous." Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get you protection, Claire. You've done the right thing. We're going to stop her." As he left Claire's apartment, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Victoria would know something was wrong soon enough, and when she did, there was no telling what she might do. He had to act fast. The moment Harris returned to the precinct, he handed over the evidence to the DA and pushed for an arrest warrant. With the photos, journals, and financial documents in hand, there was no way Victoria could talk her way out of this one. But Harris knew that the hardest part was yet to come: bringing the Seattle Black Widow to justice. Victoria Hale sat in her penthouse, the evening sky casting a pale light across the room. She sipped her wine slowly, her eyes fixed on the skyline. She had always enjoyed the quiet of these moments, when the city felt like it was hers alone. But tonight, something was different. Her intuition, always sharp, told her that things were closing in. She had noticed the irregularities in her accounts, the subtle shifts in her circle, too many eyes on her, too many questions being asked. And then there was Claire. Victoria had sensed the assistant's growing unease, but she had underestimated just how fragile Claire truly was. As Victoria placed her wine glass down, her phone rang. It was Max. "Everything's set," he said, "but you need to move now. I've secured the papers and the passports. You won't have another chance." Victoria's fingers tightened around the phone. She had always known this moment might come, the day when she would need to leave everything behind. It was why she had planned so meticulously. She had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone, always in control. But this time, something felt different. As she glanced at the photo on her mantle, one of her with Mark Dawson on their wedding day, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of regret. He had been kind. They had all been kind. But kindness was weakness, and Victoria had learned long ago that weakness had no place in her world. She stood, her mind made up. She would disappear, just as she had always planned, and they would never find her. The game was over. Just as she was about to leave, there was a loud knock on the door. Victoria froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected this so soon. Slowly, she walked toward the door and peered through the peephole. It was Detective Harris. For a moment, Victoria considered her options. She could run, there was a back exit, but Harris was sharp, And if he had come here tonight, it meant he had everything he needed. There was no escape. Not this time. With a deep breath, Victoria opened the door, her face the picture of calm. "Detective," she said, her voice smooth, "what can I do for you?" Harris stepped inside, his eyes cold and unflinching. "Victoria Hale, you're under arrest for the murders of Michael Hale, Gregory Walters, Stephen Collins, and Mark Dawson." Victoria's smile never faltered. "I assume you have evidence, Detective." Harris held up the envelope Claire had given him, and for the first time Victoria's expression shifted, only slightly. But Harris saw at the flicker of recognition, the knowledge that her game was over. "You underestimated me, Mrs. Hale," Harris said quietly, "and that's where you made your mistake." Victoria sighed, placing her hands in front of her as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "I suppose I did." As Harris led her out of the penthouse, the city lights flickered in the distance. For years, Victoria Hale had controlled her world, manipulating life and death with ease. But now, as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, she realized that even the best-laid plans eventually crumble. And for the first time, Victoria Hale was no longer in control. In the end, Victoria Hale, the Seattle Black Widow, finally faces the consequences of her carefully orchestrated murders. Despite years of evading suspicion, her arrogance and need for control become her undoing. Detective John Harris's relentless pursuit of the truth, combined with Claire Livingston's crucial evidence, exposes Victoria's web of lies and her chilling pattern of killing each of her husbands for financial gain and twisted pleasure. As Victoria is led away in handcuffs, her cold facade cracks for just a moment, signaling the end of her reign of manipulation and murder. She had always believed herself untouchable, but Harris's determination and methodical approach bring her deadly games to an abrupt halt. For Harris, the case closes with justice served, but the legacy of Victoria Hale's crimes leaves a lasting mark on Seattle. The chilling reality of how she controlled, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed the lives of those closest to her serves as a dark reminder that even the most charming and successful people can hide the darkest secrets. In the quiet town of Neal, Illinois, October 4th, 1999, would forever be marked as the day innocence was shattered. Linda Hart, a beloved figure within the small community, had built a reputation as a kind-hearted woman. She worked tirelessly at the local library, where she could often be seen recommending books or planning fundraising events. Known for her empathy and selflessness, Linda frequently organized charity drives, focusing on assisting struggling families around Neal. To most, she was the heart of the town, embodying compassion and stability. But within her own home, the picture was far more complicated than her neighbors could have imagined. Linda's marriage to Thomas Hart, a former military officer, seemed strong from an outsider's view. Thomas, however, led a double life. Behind the facade of a devoted husband, he was entangled in a secret affair with Margaret Davis, a prominent businesswoman with a relentless ambition and influence. Margaret wasn't merely interested in the thrill of an affair, she had aspirations beyond her financial success. Margaret saw Thomas not as a companion, but as a means to an end, and she was willing to push him far beyond the bounds of loyalty to achieve her ends. When Linda was found dead in her home, the circumstances around her death were as unsettling as they were brutal. Her body was discovered by her youngest son, Jake, who arrived home from school only to stumble upon the horrific scene. Evidence at the crime scene hinted at a violent struggle. Blood spattered the modest furnishings of the Hart residence, and the signs of forced entry suggested that Linda's death was not an accident. Within hours, the police were on site, and the gravity of the murder rippled through Neal, leaving its citizens anxious and fearful. Detective John Whittaker, a seasoned investigator known for his meticulous approach to solving even the most cryptic cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. Whittaker's reputation preceded him, with years of service and a keen eye for unraveling convoluted schemes. As he examined the scene, one thing became abundantly clear: Linda's death was not the work of a lone intruder. Whoever was responsible had orchestrated this murder with chilling precision, leaving minimal evidence and few immediate leads. However, as Whittaker delved deeper, he began uncovering peculiar traces: footprints in the muddy garden outside, a partially used pack of cigarettes left near the back door, and most notably, a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume that lingered near the entrance. These seemingly minor details hinted at more than a random act of violence. they suggested careful planning and intent. Detective Whitaker knew he was dealing with something far more layered than a simple home invasion. Days passed, and the investigation intensified. Interviews with friends, family, and acquaintances painted a picture of Linda's life, yet the cracks in her marriage started to reveal themselves. Soon, an unexpected detail emerged: Thomas Hart's affair with Margaret Davis. This discovery not only shocked the town but also laid the foundation for a deeper probe. Whitaker's suspicions were aroused further when phone records showed frequent, late-night calls between Thomas and Margaret, particularly in the days leading up to Linda's murder. Neil's peaceful veneer was beginning to fracture, revealing the darker motives that had festered beneath the surface. As Whitaker delved into the couple's financial records, an unsettling pattern emerged. Unexplained withdrawals and sudden transfers traced back to accounts linked to Margaret, and Thomas's spending habits raised eyebrows. The paper trail was faint but visible to an investigator with Whitaker's experience. These suspicious transactions suggested that a financial relationship, possibly one tied to a sinister plan, was in motion. It became increasingly apparent that Margaret was not simply Thomas's mistress. She was a manipulative force, perhaps even the architect of a scheme aimed at eliminating Linda from the picture altogether. With the affair between Thomas Hart and Margaret Davis uncovered, Detective Whitaker intensified his scrutiny of Margaret. An established and influential figure in Neil, Margaret owned a thriving property development company, with connections that extended well beyond the small town's limits. Her public persona was that of a fierce and independent woman, yet within her circle, Margaret's ruthlessness and willingness to exploit others for gain were well known. To those she could not control, she posed a formidable threat, known for using intimidation to get her way. Whitaker had begun to suspect that Linda's murder was the product of a carefully crafted plan, driven by a motive far more complex than jealousy. Margaret's manipulation of Thomas was deeply rooted in control. Having ensnared him in the affair, she then turned the tables on him, using their illicit relationship as leverage. According to records and testimony from friends, Margaret had been pressuring Thomas for months, insisting that he take care of his marriage, which she saw as an obstacle to their continued affair. When Thomas resisted, fearing the impact of a divorce on his children, Margaret's tactics shifted. Threats replaced promises, and she began to openly blackmail him, suggesting that she would expose the affair to Linda and the entire town if he didn't comply with her demands. Driven into a corner, Thomas found himself trapped in a scheme he couldn't control. Witnesses later described him as a man burdened, often seen walking the streets in the early morning hours, as though he were carrying an unbearable weight. Despite his guilt, his reluctance to take action only seemed to further fuel Margaret's aggression. Soon, her threats escalated from exposure to something more sinister. Margaret devised a brutal plan to eliminate Linda, hiring 3 known criminals from a neighboring city. Peter Randall, George Miller, and Patricia Milan each had criminal records marked by petty theft and minor offenses, making them the perfect, disposable pawns for the task. Through anonymous channels, Margaret funneled money to the trio, securing their loyalty and silence with promises of a substantial payout upon completing their mission. As the plan took shape, Patricia, whose expertise lay in planning and coordination, developed a meticulous timetable, instructing Peter and George on their roles. Their task was clear: enter the Hart residence, silence Linda, and leave no trace behind. The night of October 4th, 1999, became the critical juncture. With the help of Patricia's oversight, Peter and George forced entry into the Hart home. Though Linda put up a fight, her efforts were overpowered. The brutality of the murder suggested both desperation and anger, with Linda's last moments marked by a struggle that left her bruised and bloodied, the home's interior bearing the evidence of a life taken too soon. The murder was swift, yet chaotic, and in their haste, Peter left behind a vital clue: his DNA, smeared on a piece of furniture that had been knocked over during the violent encounter. In the immediate aftermath, Margaret remained resolute, distancing herself from the crime as the shock of Linda's death rippled through the town. She calculated her every move, certain that her connections and planning would shield her from suspicion. But Detective Whitaker, armed with intuition and persistence, sensed the underlying threads of a conspiracy, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he could connect the evidence to those responsible. The pieces were there, hidden beneath layers of deceit, waiting to expose the culprits. Detective Whitaker's patience and attention to detail were legendary, and as he sifted through the mounting evidence, he grew more convinced that Margaret Davis was not only involved but was orchestrating events from a distance. Initial DNA samples taken from the crime scene were rushed to the forensics lab, and within days, results identified Peter Randall as a match. His criminal history, paired with his connection to known associates of Margaret Davis, painted a compelling picture of conspiracy. Phone records and financial transactions became the core of Whitaker's investigation. Margaret's seemingly airtight plan began to crack as Whitaker and his team unearthed a series of bank transfers originating from a shell account under Margaret's control. These transactions aligned suspiciously with Linda's murder, particularly one transfer made directly to Patricia Milan's account, only days before the killing. This single piece of evidence placed Margaret's involvement beyond reasonable doubt. It was clear that she had funded Linda's murder. As Whitaker probed deeper, he found that Margaret had taken elaborate steps to keep her tracks covered, but small inconsistencies began to surface. Phone records showed that Thomas had been receiving late-night calls from Margaret around the time Linda's murder was being planned, a time when he claimed he had been attempting to distance himself from her. Yet the tone and frequency of these calls suggested something different, a tightening grip on a man unraveling under pressure. Thomas, meanwhile, had grown paranoid. Colleagues and neighbors noticed his increasingly erratic behavior, which suggested an inner turmoil that no amount of composure could hide. Whitaker seized on Thomas's vulnerability, pulling him in for questioning as an informal witness. During the interview, Thomas appeared fraught with nerves, his responses evasive. The detective noted every tremor, every hesitant glance. Beneath his exterior, Thomas was breaking under the weight of guilt, yet he stopped short of directly implicating Margaret, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps loyalty. But Whitaker sensed that the truth was slipping closer to the surface with each passing day. Days turned into weeks, and Whitaker's team uncovered damning evidence that solidified the connection between Margaret and the hired perpetrators. Security camera footage from an ATM showed Patricia Milan making a withdrawal just hours before Linda's murder, a withdrawal that matched the sum wired from Margaret's account. The timeline of transactions, combined with the physical evidence, formed a damning portrait of a premeditated crime with Margaret at its helm. As each new piece of evidence surfaced, the town of Neal braced itself for the fallout, realizing that the prominent and once respected Margaret Davis might have orchestrated the tragic murder of one of their own. With the evidence stacking up against Margaret and her hired accomplices, Detective Whitaker began the arrests. First to be detained was Peter Randall, whose DNA placed him directly at the crime scene. His arrest was swift and silent. He was picked up from his dilapidated apartment in a nearby city, handcuffed and whisked away before he had time to resist. During his interrogation, Peter remained stoic, refusing to speak beyond confirming his name. But the evidence against him was undeniable: his DNA on the furniture, his bank records linking him to Margaret's transfers, and his known associations with both Patricia and George. George Miller was apprehended next. Unlike Peter, George was visibly shaken when detectives arrived at his workplace. Known for his minor criminal exploits, George was unaccustomed to high-stakes crime and quickly crumbled under pressure. During his initial questioning, he repeatedly mentioned Patricia Milan, casting her as the one who called the shots and managed the details of the crime. Although he did not implicate Margaret directly, his statements provided a critical insight into the hierarchy within their operation. Detective Whitaker knew that Patricia Milan would be the toughest to break. As the alleged coordinator of the murder, Detective Whitaker knew that Patricia Milan would be the toughest to break. As the alleged coordinator of the murder, she was smart, calculated, and well-versed in keeping her dealings hidden. When the police finally located her in a rented apartment outside of Neal, Patricia didn't resist arrest, but her cold demeanor indicated a confidence that rattled even seasoned officers. She met Whitaker's questions with indifference, responding only in clipped, vague answers that revealed little. However, as the pieces of the investigation closed in on her, Patricia's resolve began to falter. In a crucial breakthrough, Whitaker obtained an encrypted notebook from Patricia's belongings, a carefully coded ledger that, once decoded, revealed payment schedules and references to tasks. Though cryptic, one entry had a date matching Linda's murder, along with notes about payments to P&G, believed to be Peter and George. With this evidence in hand, Whitaker was certain he now had Margaret's direct chain of communication with her hired criminals. The ledger linked Patricia to Margaret, and the final puzzle pieces began to fit together. The arrests of Peter, George, and Patricia sent shock waves through Neil, and people could hardly believe that someone as prominent as Margaret Davis could be at the center of such a horrific crime. But as more information trickled into the public eye, whispers grew louder. People recalled the subtle tension between Margaret and Linda, the strange way Margaret's business interests often veered into morally questionable territory. Speculations brewed over how deep her connections went, and why Thomas had allowed himself to become tangled in Margaret's schemes. The air was thick with anxiety, as if the whole town were watching the case unfold in slow motion, their trust shattered in someone they once held in high esteem. Detective Whittaker knew it was time to move on Margaret herself, the alleged mastermind. He arrived at her office with an arrest warrant in hand, accompanied by 2 officers. Margaret maintained her composure, smiling politely at Whittaker as if this were merely an inconvenience. As she was escorted from her office in handcuffs, reporters and townsfolk alike gathered outside, their disbelief giving way to anger and resentment. Margaret had always prided herself on her reputation, and now, before the entire town, her downfall played out in a public display of betrayal and shame. The trial was set to be the most high-profile case Neil had ever seen. The courtroom was packed with reporters, locals, and curious onlookers who had followed every twist in the investigation. Thomas Hart was called as a witness, his role ambiguous but crucial. He looked haggard, years older than his actual age, and the weight of the guilt was visible in his demeanor. On the stand, he answered questions with evident reluctance, admitting to his affair with Margaret and confessing that he had been blackmailed by her for months. However, he insisted he had never intended for any harm to come to his wife, describing his role as a passive one, albeit complicit by silence. The prosecution used Thomas's testimony to establish Margaret as the driving force behind Linda's murder. Margaret, they argued, manipulated Thomas into dependence, weaving him into her schemes until he was too compromised to back out. They painted her as a woman who saw people as pawns, each used to further her own agenda. Margaret's defense team, however, claimed that there was no direct evidence linking her to the crime, asserting that she had merely had a relationship with Thomas and nothing more. However, the prosecution's case grew stronger with each witness, particularly Patricia Milan, who had ultimately struck a deal in exchange for a reduced sentence. Patricia revealed details of the planning stages of the murder, implicating Margaret as the one who had orchestrated every step. According to Patricia, Margaret's hold over Thomas was chilling. She described Margaret as a master manipulator who threatened, coerced, and intimidated anyone who dared cross her. Patricia's testimony, combined with the financial records and evidence from the crime scene, made it nearly impossible for Margaret's defense team to dismantle the prosecution's argument. Finally, Whittaker presented the crucial ledger found in Patricia's possession. As the prosecution laid out each detail, the audience could see the meticulous planning that went into the crime, leaving no doubt that this was no crime of passion but a calculated, heartless act. The court listened in silence, and Margaret, for the first time, appeared shaken, her facade crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. By the trial's end, the outcome seemed inevitable. Margaret was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole, ordered to pay restitution to the Hart family. Peter Randall received a life sentence, while George Miller received 25 years due to his cooperation and lesser role. Patricia Milan, instrumental in exposing the plot, was sentenced to 40 years, with the possibility of parole after 25. The trial's end marked a close to a harrowing chapter for the town of Neil, yet its scars ran deep. Linda's family mourned, not only her tragic death but the destruction of their family at the hands of deceit and greed. As for Detective Whittaker, he returned to his routine, but his role in exposing this tragedy became a part of his legacy, a case that would serve as a warning and a lesson in training programs across Illinois. In the aftermath, Linda's law was passed, tightening penalties on harassment and establishing new protective measures for victims of blackmail and coercion. The courtroom verdict might have closed the legal chapter of Linda Hart's murder, but for the residents of Neil, Illinois, the effects of the crime continued to linger like a dark shadow over the town. As the news of Margaret's sentencing settled in, people in Neil found themselves grappling with feelings of betrayal, anger, and disbelief. Margaret Davis, a woman who had once embodied success and prestige, was now a convicted murderer, stripped of her reputation and left to face life in prison. In the weeks that followed, conversations at local cafes and church gatherings circled endlessly around the case. The townsfolk who had once admired Margaret's business success and charm now looked back and questioned everything they thought they knew about her. Parents warned their children to steer clear of ambition without compassion, and Margaret's family, humiliated and shunned, eventually left Neil altogether. Her estate, which had once been the centerpiece of her influence, went up for sale, attracting sightseers more than buyers. Thomas Hart, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his life, burdened by the consequences of his actions. His job at the local mechanic shop became his only solace, though his interactions with co-workers and customers were now clouded by distrust. His two children, especially Jake the youngest who had found Linda's body, were left with deep psychological scars. Friends and neighbors distanced themselves from Thomas, seeing him not as a victim of manipulation, but as a complicit when Margaret had spun. The Hart family, once admired, became a tragic emblem of betrayal and shattered innocence, their lives forever marred by choices that had been so far beyond their control. Detective John Whittaker moved on to new cases, but he couldn't shake the weight of this one. Linda Hart's murder had been one of the most intricate and heart-wrenching cases of his career, a textbook example of how manipulation could escalate into horror. It changed him, bringing a new level of vigilance and skepticism to his work. His detailed notes and reports from the case would later serve as a basis for training materials in police academies across Illinois, a reminder to law enforcement officers of how even small-town crimes could conceal layers of planning and premeditation. The tragedy of Linda Hart's murder reverberated far beyond Neil's town limits. In the months after the trial, Illinois' lawmakers began discussions around a new piece of legislation, inspired by the manipulation and coercion that had ultimately led to Linda's death. Linda's Law, as it came to be known, aimed to tackle the gaps in the legal system that had allowed individuals like Margaret Davis to evade scrutiny of harassment, blackmail, and coercion. Linda's Law focused on expanding the definitions of harassment and introducing harsher penalties for anyone proven to engage in blackmail that could lead to harm. It provided police departments with broader investigative powers in cases of domestic threats and introduced special training for officers, teaching them to recognize signs of coercive control and psychological abuse. Law enforcement agencies across Illinois were mandated to follow specific protocols in cases where one partner showed signs of manipulating or threatening the other, even if no physical violence had occurred. Linda's Law was hailed as a landmark piece of legislation. Advocates for domestic violence victims saw it as a breakthrough that recognized the deadly potential of psychological abuse. Though Linda's case was tragic, her name became synonymous with the movement for increased protections and vigilance, an enduring symbol for those fighting against coercive relationships and manipulation. Whittaker, deeply moved by the impact of the case, was invited to deliver training sessions based on his experience with the investigation. He recounted every painstaking detail: the careful unraveling of Margaret's motives, the slow but certain linking of evidence to Thomas, and the relentless pursuit of justice for Linda. For the officers in training, Whittaker's account served as both a sobering warning and a lesson in the importance of patience, precision, and empathy when investigating crimes born out of personal manipulation and greed. For Neil's community, Linda's Law represented not only the legacy of a cherished woman, but a hope that no other family would have to endure betrayal that had destroyed the Harts. Years passed, but the tragedy that befell Linda Hart remained etched in the memory of Neil, Illinois. The events surrounding her murder, the arrests, and the subsequent trial were gradually absorbed into the town's history, but they never truly faded. Every October 4th, the townsfolk held a quiet vigil in Linda's honor, gathering at the library where she had devoted so much of her time and energy. Surrounded by flowers, candles, and quiet reflections, Linda's legacy as a compassionate soul dedicated to her community endured. Thomas Hart, still living in Neil, lived a quiet and solitary life, working odd jobs and carrying the burden of a past he could never fully escape. His children, especially Jake, bore their own scars. Jake had struggled to reconcile the loss of his mother and the bitter truth about his father's role in it. After years of therapy and moving away for school, he eventually found peace, though it took time and distance from Neil to heal. Jake rarely returned to the town, but he never missed sending flowers to the vigil each October. Margaret Davis's life sentence brought some solace to the Hart family, but for those who had known her, the memory of her betrayal served as a lesson in the dangers of unchecked ambition and manipulation. Her case continued to be studied by criminologists and psychologists alike, her calculated actions illustrating the darkness that could lie beneath a charming exterior. She remained in prison, a figure of both infamy and caution, rarely seeing visitors or making any contact with the outside world. In time, even her family distanced themselves, eager to escape the shadow of her crimes. Detective John Whitaker continued his career with a newfound commitment to understanding and addressing the nuances of psychological abuse and manipulation. Linda's Law became a cornerstone of his work, inspiring police departments across Illinois to take coercive control and blackmail as seriously as physical violence. Whitaker retired a decade after Linda's case, but he remained involved in police training, using her story to teach younger officers the importance of seeing beyond the surface in every case. In Neal, Linda's Law took on a profound significance as locals saw it as a tribute to a woman who had exemplified kindness, only to fall victim to betrayal. The law became a part of Illinois' legacy, extending protections for those vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Linda's story was more than a case, it was a reminder of resilience, justice, and the power of change in the face of tragedy. The town eventually returned to its rhythm, but Linda's memory lingered as a gentle presence. Her portrait hung in the library, a plaque beneath it inscribed with the words, "In memory of Linda Hart, a light that shines through kindness, remembered always." It became a place of quiet reflection, a space for townsfolk to recall that, even in the darkest times, justice could prevail, and from grief, lasting change could emerge. Years after the case that had changed Neal forever, the town had settled back into its familiar calm, though Linda Hart's story was woven deeply into its fabric. The library, where she had spent countless hours working and giving back, was renamed the Linda Hart Community Library, symbolizing her enduring legacy. The shelves were filled with books she had once recommended, with a small corner dedicated to her memory, a place where children gathered for story hour. Families donated books, and townsfolk came to read and reflect. Detective John Whitaker, now retired, often visited the library. He'd find a quiet spot near the plaque dedicated to Linda, a reminder of the case that had shaped not only his career but also his understanding of the human capacity for both darkness and redemption. He sometimes spotted Jake Hart, who would return to Neal quietly, visiting on Linda's anniversary or leaving flowers on her plaque. Jake had grown into a resilient young man, moving past the trauma that had marked his early years and working with charities focused on supporting children who had suffered similar losses. Linda's legacy lived on through him in ways she would have been proud of. Linda's Law, meanwhile, had left a lasting impact across Illinois, becoming a landmark in legislation that other states sought to replicate. Cases involving coercive control, blackmail, and harassment were now treated with heightened seriousness, giving victims the legal support Linda hadn't had. Law enforcement agencies across the state incorporated Linda's Law training modules, focusing on identifying the warning signs of psychological abuse and manipulation. Detective Whitaker's case notes and detailed reports served as valuable materials, educating a new generation of officers on the complexities of such crimes. For the people of Neal, Linda's memory was a bittersweet symbol of kindness and resilience. Her story was no longer only one of tragedy, but of transformation. Linda's life and death had inspired changes that protected countless others from similar fates, reminding the town and eventually the state that justice and compassion could grow even from unimaginable loss. As autumn leaves blanketed Neal each October, the library vigil continued, townsfolk gathering quietly to honor Linda's life and legacy. The plaque bearing her name read, "In memory of Linda Hart, a beacon of kindness whose light will never fade." It was a small, steady reminder that although her life had been taken too soon, the values she lived by had taken root, leaving behind a legacy that would guide and protect others for generations to come.